And then
Is everything else happening?
I hope so.
You hope so.
Yeah, I checked that the recordings for yesterday and this morning actually exists.
Okay, so we're still in the Hangout.
Let's see later if anyone can.
Okay. So the purpose of this session is to make a list and discuss potential protocol dependencies of what we've been talking about. And I'll leave off of it whether we're actually going to do this work or not, but just trying to make a slide with a list of the protocol dependencies, assuming we were to do the things we talked about. And so we will be developing these slides as we speak and talk. So we have this list that Stefan and I put together. It may not be complete, so feel free to suggest additional things. So in the end-to-end security work that UN presented, the question is whether there were any protocol dependencies in what was discussed for any of the potential scenarios, or whether or not. So, I mean, we talked about some scenarios that only involved perk double and some that required full perk, but were there any that required anything other than those two things, which are already in progress?
I don't think it was a hard requirement to perk per se, but I think conceptually it bears a lot of resemblance to that. So what we said is, of the free use case, the top one, non-trusted, is the use case on which perk is based. So that's supposedly what the use case that perk is providing a solution for.
So were there any?
The last one, not the iframe, but the one where you trust the JavaScript, perk light, right, conceptually is, or something that is conceptually based on the double encryption document only out of the perk working group, is close to what we're aiming for. But I don't think at this stage we have nailed down the implementation. We have to say that. I think it's cool.
Can you get the mic?
Yeah, I think it's the general is perk and the general trusted use case is perk, and the two other ones just require this double encryption.
But to answer the original question, is there a dependency? I think the answer is no.
Yeah, well,
conceptually close.
I mean, if the application is the one implementing it, then the answer is no. If the browser is the one implementing it, then we have dependency on something somewhere.
Right.
But the question is what? So first we have to decide whether it's baked into the browser or there are just tools available for the application to be able to implement it.
So how about this? Dependency on IETF perk documents only if implemented.
Well, even then, it might not be a perk document necessarily.
Right. So potential dependency?
Yeah.
Okay.
I was thinking somebody was mentioning a more precise document. So double maybe we could mention this one because I guess that's the one.
So
right. And then it's not double by itself is not enough because then you would also need the frame header extension.
The key and then the
well, that's not a protocol dependency per se.
That's frame markup option, right? Plus double.
But these are all maybes, right? Like.
Yeah, sure.
Right.
Well, hold on. So. Did we say, I left it kind of vague, IETF perk documents, because it might be the just double, yeah.
I'd say a potential dependency on a document for how the encryption works and a document for how the metadata, the header extension works. And the one might be in perk and the other might be the one that's in AVT4. Those are combined now, right? Or AVT. Payload. I don't remember which working group has the framework.
So I had a question. It's not related to end-to-end security, but it was recently brought to light when we wrote a blog post on perk that a lot of people feel that perk's going to fail because the unresolved issue with FEC and encryption and the way FEC is currently implemented.
Right.
Yeah.
And like
that's why this is a maybe.
Yeah, but like putting down a node where it's a maybe where people have strong opinions, then
well, I mean, you could put we need a if it's in the browser, then we need a document somewhere about
Maybe just
what
mean we don't have enough information.
that could be. Yeah. But I agree that like
So I would say at least FEC should
I-
also be marked reported.
Remember
should
that
Percolite-
magically the double document went to last call or proposed candidate by itself
By itself, right?
a few months, even though the other document did not. So anything can happen.
So should Percolite be mentioned as well? Or
No comment.
I don't think we
There's
should be
no
too
reference
specific.
document for Percolite per se.
Percolite is just like, or did we?
I think
No,
for now,
Percolite was a proposal that was rejected.
and our work, we might come up with a different proposal.
Correct. Especially
Right.
if we take a full frame instead of
Right, exactly.
document sort. So I prefer not to mention it.
Okay. So this is what I've got. ITF perk documents only if implemented in browser, the potential dependency on frame marking, potential dependency on FEC-RTX implementation. Is that it for intent security? Okay, and then we're going to have separate slides on a bunch of different things. ICE, quick. We crossed off SDP support for quick, because the assumption is that would never be needed.
I don't think we need it.
So it's
Maybe in
crossed
some
off.
distant future, some music item might.
They
be
can always
something.
create it and
Yeah,
have it
so-
be ignored, but it's not on the dependency list.
It might be reconsidered if we have an advocate for it.
Right.
Not if we don't.
Okay, so let's talk about ICE. And you had a list of things, Peter. So we wanted to things that are not in trickle or 5245 bis. Go ahead and type.
So like I said before, there was
Right.
I don't think candidate removal actually needs to be. So the first two we talked about, and I don't think we really have a need for the first one.
For freezing optional, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we could go and
It's kind of implicitly optional because people aren't doing it.
right.
Nothing bad is happening. So
Suppose we could go to the ICE working group and say, hey, can we make a doc that says that whole section is optional? But I don't think it matters. Renomination is if we want to allow that method to be called more than once. Like Chrome already implements that draft. So I suppose if we thought there was enough need for that to be adopted, we could go back to the ICE working group and say, hey, there's a lot of interest for this draft to actually be adopted. At the time I proposed it 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, I can't remember. There wasn't enough interest. And then candidate removal, I don't think there's anything that needs to be mentioned in the ICE working group.
well, you can't today. You can't signal removal though, right?
Well, removal is just it basically means you're removing candidate pairs on your local
Right.
ICE agent. And like, there's nothing that needs to be in the ICE spec for a particular ICE agent to do that.
But you can't. I guess. Yeah. You don't.
There's no standardized signaling for it. You
Right.
know?
It's been implemented though. So
I think of that more as an API thing.
right. Is there anything else?
So I don't think we really need the
There was
third one.
some. Yeah.
I would say that the second one is the most likely thing that we might want to push for, but even that, I'm not entirely sure it's worth it.
There were a few knobs, but I don't think those were really protocol knobs necessarily.
No, they were all like, they were all changes in behavior that the ICE agent is already free to do.
Right. Okay, so this is a relatively small list.
Yeah, I think it's maybe the second one Definitely not the third one, and probably not the first one.
Yeah, I also had I was thinking of a question relating to the scenarios we had where you're moving between candidates and keeping candidates alive. Is that on this list? Like I'm presuming this is prior to nomination, or
Yeah, so
like
I went-
not nominating or never nominating.
So you're talking about kind of retaining local candidates without pruning them?
Yeah.
Or sorry, deactivating it, whatever the ICE spec uses, whatever word it uses. And I went and read through the spec, and it doesn't say that the agent must do so.
Right. It doesn't. Well,
Which means-
even after nomination, it doesn't say that they have
Right,
to
it doesn't,
prune.
it doesn't have to.
Oh, okay.
There's no must there.
Right. So if you did renomination, you have the ability to deal with it, I guess.
So you could always keep a candidate around. You just, according to the spec, wouldn't be able to nominate any
Right.
any candidate pair after you've nominated.
Yeah, I guess the question is, when you do that, right, both sides might have non-nominated pairs,
Mhm.
but how do you know which pairs are, I guess you just keep checking them to know which pairs are alive. Is that
Mhm.
the general idea? Yeah.
And there's nothing
Okay.
that says that an ICE agent can't do that.
Can't do
so
that, right.
The only thing that we can't do right now is nominate more than once.
Right.
And so that's why the second one.
So I had another question about, I think yesterday's list had a lot of attributes on it. So one that I remember was about pacing.
Mhm.
And so is that in, out, or?
Yeah, it's in. So the standard just gives basically a limit on how fast you can pace. And then the WEBRTC spec has the consent freshness.
Right.
But other than that, the ICE agent can check at whatever frequency it wants.
But we wanted to open that up to the app, right?
Yeah.
That was like,
Yeah.
The app can say slow down, basically,
or go back.
or go faster. Right. Up to a.
Yeah, depending on what the default is.
Right. Okay. So yeah, so we're basically left with two protocol, really only majorly one protocol dependency.
Yeah, and
the
then
nomination has been discussed several times. So.
yeah, it's an expired draft, but never adopted.
And
Implemented but never adopted.
Yeah.
And the attributes for cost and things like that, you see that as an ICE extension, or?
So that, okay, so there are two parts about network cost. One of them is signaling it, and the app would be free to do so, because assuming it can tell the difference between Wi-Fi and cell, it could use that information and attach it to the candidate when it signals it. The second is including it in the stun checks, which are useful for when you get a pure reflexive candidate. And that is something that isn't covered by FlexIce right now. There's no I didn't include any mechanism for the app to say, when you send a stun check, use this as the network cost, so that if we end up with a pure reflexive candidate that doesn't match any candidate I signaled, it will know the network cost. So that is kind of a...
So that would mean that the app could add any kind of attributes to it, not just network cost, but
I didn't put anything for adding arbitrary attributes.
Oh, only network cost.
No, I didn't put it for network cost either. That is something that was available in Slice, but not FlexIce. Now, that's not to say that FlexIce couldn't do that. I just didn't put anything at the moment there. That's kind of it's a bit of an edge case, but there might be situations
I
where...
haven't really thought of it because it's the app on both sides. The only thing I was thinking about is that now that we're not using priority for resorting the checks, like creating the whole thing and doing the checks with whatever we're thinking about, then if you're resorting them on some arbitrary logic, it might be easy to have the same logic appear on both sides.
Mm. Yeah.
Well, the default would be that it would use the same order that you normally get. It would only be if the app specifically said, use this order. But yeah, then, I mean, I suppose you could do something like, it's a little bit hacky, but after a network route is working, no, never mind, too hacky.
Yeah, I don't know, as in I've not really thought about it, except like it came up when I thought about it before, so I don't remember what my actual reasoning
or?
There are cases where it is handy to be able to attach some information in a check for pyroflexive candidates about your opinion of that candidate that would be lost if the signaling wasn't able to match it up.
Yeah. So I think we have the list for ICE at least.
Yeah.
But stick around, we're going to have more.
Oh.
So we'll get rid of the candidate removal, I guess. Figure that out for us.
Yeah.
So next list was quick. So we had for unreliable streams, I guess there was this basic support for unreliable quick. And that included stuff like max retransmits and packet lifetime.
Well, that's sure.
The two proposals or whatever they were. There would be the quick data channel proposal if you wanted to protocol. You wanted to write a shim on top of it, although it's not required for the quick work we were talking about here.
Yeah, I think both. You might rewrite it as like quick working group stuff.
It's just, yeah, quick transport document.
So unreliability.
Right.
I don't know if we need to get too specific about these things, just unreliability in general.
Yeah.
And then you say on top of quick.
Right, on top of quick, yeah. Although there's the basic, for the reliable, the only dependency is quick transport.
Sorry, I missed the last part.
For the existing transport spec, the only dependency is just the quick transport document. Doesn't depend on unreliable currently.
Are we listing new work that needs to happen, or
Well, the quick thing is new work, so
no, I mean okay for so there's like stuff as is,
as
quick
is, right?
documents.
Just quick, yeah,
in
just
progress.
quick documents in progress.
I
And
think
then-
there's core and
Transport,
transport.
Yeah.
Not HTTP.
no,
And then you got new stuff.
new stuff, right? New stuff is unreliable.
Oh, sorry. And then,
Nope.
Right.
Right. Okay. And then, yeah.
of course, this won't be a dependency for now because we haven't. What was the word? Endorsed.
We haven't endorsed it.
Endorsed it. So
We haven't birthed it, so we can't adopt it, and then we can't endorse it.
anyway, if we did later on, then these would be the potential.
And then we'd have to argue about whether we'd separate it from the parent at the border.
Okay. Is that enough for quick?
Okay.
Let's not make it too cruel.
So SCTP, I think that list we had was remove one initial RTT, the per channel back pressure flow. The more AV friendly congestion control, BBR's already specified though, right? Somewhere?
I don't think that's not a. Is there a standard word here?
This is, I don't even know that this necessarily gets into the standard to even depend on. Would BBR even be a normative reference? If not, we don't mention it in the quick spec today, so. Or SCTP, it wouldn't be mentioned in the data channel.
The question is, do we want AV friendly or do we want a plug-inable interface where you would say like PBR would be one of them, and then people would want lead bat or something else, because there was the other question that
Right.
someone wanted. So there was lead bat. So it's more like a plug-inable interface where there would be,
Yeah, but
if there would be.
Yeah. So I guess what we're trying to get here is there some algorithm that's likely to be used that wouldn't be documented, that might have some, like if you had a pluggable congestion control enum and it had BBR, it would probably need to reference something. And are there any missing references?
So I can't say about BBR because the last I heard of it was that it was still being used by some people, and it will be brought to the IETF, but I don't know the adoption status.
Is there a draft for BBR?
There's definitely a draft for BBR, but I don't know if it's been adopted by anybody.
Okay.
TCPM might be, if someone's willing to look at it.
Is there a need to document the way that interaction works? So how does it relate to RTP? Is that something one would have to document separately from the BBR document itself?
Won't be here. At least I don't think WebRTC documents actually should document.
Yeah, well, I haven't read the BBR draft, so I don't know what it talks about. Is it a Navy congestion control draft? No.
It's a TCP, but uses latency.
Yeah.
And latency targets as one. So it's like Vegas plus plus plus.
Yeah.
My point was, how does it, because we're using it to control two different transports, does the interaction between them have to be documented above the congestion control?
No, here it would only be used to, it would be used for SCTP, at least on this slide. And so the way to think about it, Tim, is that, just like regular SCTP, New Reno, whatever, has an interaction with various, RMCAT specified congestion control mechanism, this would as well. How exactly that works is a research problem, not a, you'd want to know that, but it's not specified in the algorithm itself.
Yeah, and some people might document it, but I don't think BBR does because they won't test against unknown protocols.
So anyway, what we have
don't
here,
want to either.
I guess the question is there some algorithms we're interested in that are not documented? LEDBAT is documented.
It's an RFC.
Yeah, is there something that's not, for this list, is there something that's not documented?
Well, we don't even know if BBR is or not.
That's why I put a question mark next to it.
I found there is a draft.
There is a draft.
In the ICCR.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
But is there one in TCPM or TCP?
So I guess it's on the list because we'd like it to be finished. Oh, so they're actually work items of that?
What is the other one?
There's the other one was called.
Okay. So these are the slides expressing the dependencies so far. And the question is there anything we missed out of all of the discussions we had?
The other question I had was, I'm not even sure if it was ever documented anywhere as an IETF document.
It wasn't? I think it was.
It was finally? Recent.
Oh yeah, that was done quite a while. Like data channel TCP, all that stuff was done in that era of congestion control. Is there anything else missing from these slides? Let me go back to the first one. Oh yeah, so item 6 is anything needed for SVC. And I think other than various bitstream specs, I don't think so.
Is this just new
RTP
items or is this existing ones as well?
These are things that are dependencies of the work that we've been discussing.
Okay.
So is that Leonard?
Yeah.
So we think we got the things you were talking about on these slides.
I think they're on.
They're all there.
We have briefly discussed message interleaving as well, but I think it's already mandatory, so we probably don't need to add it.
Right. So anyway, we'll assume these are complete, absent any comments to the contrary. So I think we're finished with this particular portion of the agenda. And we can turn it over to Varun and Harold for the exciting topic of stats. Take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. All right, quick spec status. So since TPAC 17, which was about 8 months ago, I think just after we asked for CR, then we've spent some time, and Dom has an update on the CR. Do you want to?
Yes. So if everything goes well, we should be able to proceed with the CR hopefully next week. So first, I mean, my apologies. There was a series of both misunderstandings and gaps in the discussions due to various personal issues. But hopefully I have a pull request that I'm trying to get confirmation that it addressed the concern that was raised. And once I have this confirmation, I'll submit it. Hopefully it won't be an issue to get it merged. And in that case, we should be able to proceed with publication very soon now.
Awesome, and thanks to everyone who contributed. So are we done? So when I was writing these slides, it's more like a troll question, maybe, and it's perhaps not. We're nowhere close to being done. And because there are several issues. One that was come up routinely is experimental stats, because when we started the document, we said we wanted to document metrics that are well understood. Now we've landed up in territories where we're adding things that are not very well understood. Like we're doing things like we'll do quick and we are doing SCTP. There are like lots of new things that we're doing. The new objects, the metrics on those objects, some of them have never been defined before. So in this process, we came up with things to do. So if you want to propose a new stat, you make an issue and you may get feedback on that issue. If you are overzealous, you can also make a PR, and that would make it easier for us because we would see the issue and then we would have a PR, we can compare. And if it all makes sense, ping Harold or I, and if we don't understand it enough, we will try to ping more people and get it reviewed by the people who understand it, as well as the person who made the original proposal. Fix and review comments. We've tried this, but in I wouldn't say many, in some cases, we've not made any headway. So Henrik came up with the idea of doing WebRTC provisional stats, and there's a link there. What's the status? Have you started adding some things to it?
The draft is still empty.
Okay, so maybe we'll find some energy to like at least.
So yeah, it was added when as some compromise where there were stats that people wanted to add, but we couldn't find hit the standards bar of like, for example, what would be the definition of if something is audible or not. And the idea was it's better to document something than to have some horrible Goog stat.
Well, one is that, and you can't have like definitions in issues because they get lost.
Yeah, and with the goal to always move stuff over from the provisional document to the real document when issues have been resolved. But this we've never added stuff here because we've had this issue where people file an issue saying, "Oh, this would be nice to have," and then we like, "Well, what about this? Like, this isn't well defined." And then there's no follow-up.
Yeah, and actually the other question was how would we introduce experimental stats into the existing systems? I've not actually documented that anywhere. Maybe we'll come back to that later as we go on.
And now
but that's something that we should.
We've also this Chrome side, but this origin trials, like there will be means to add experimental stats without exposing them to the web platform, which would be a good first step before you fleshed out what the definition is. But that's sort of...
So my concern is that new stats is a new JavaScript API, just like any other API. And I guess, does it deserve special treatment? If there are stats for new features, shouldn't they be wherever the new features are added, like incubator specs, or do we need a specific place to register new stats like this?
Well, we're talking about stat. Well, there are two parts of it. One is there's a stat on an existing object that already exists, and we just realize while through operational field trials or whatever that there is a missing stat that needs to be added to, let's say, an existing object. And that's a metric, and just like one key in an existing dictionary. So there's that aspect, and some of those are very well understood because they were defined somewhere. It was just something that we did not think was important early when we created the WebRTC stats. And that's easy because you make a proposal, you follow those steps, it will get merged, and at some point the browsers will implement them. But there's the second part of it that there are, like he brought up, like Henrik brought up, there is audible stats. And we had this problem by it's very well understood what audible means, but there's no definition for it, which makes it undefined in some sense because we do not know if different browsers would implement it in exactly the same way.
Or echo likelihood, like would the value 0.8 mean the same thing in Chrome as it does in Firefox?
Unless you expose the algorithm of how you calculated the echo likelihood.
Which might even have been proprietary, I'm sure.
Yeah. So there is that aspect, and I just made a document, made a slide later, we'll come back to it. But then there's the implementation status. So on a spec level, I feel very confident that we have done a good job. We've added a lot of new metrics over the last few years. A lot of the metrics make sense. I would say we've doubled or tripled the number of metrics over the last 2 years, which is good, but there's a lot of implementation work needed. So we built, so at the last TPAC, people asked us, could we do something to highlight how well this thing works? So we just released, I'll come back to this, but what we did is, can I use kind of WebRTC stats? And so right now we are using Kite, and it's audio only and video only scenario. So this is Chrome 62 and Firefox. And you can see 38 and 100, which is abysmal. And I don't want to even get into the other browsers because they do even fewer. For video, it's 44. So we decided to verify the implementations. We're going to extend this more. So we want to extend it to, because it's only audio and video at the moment, want to extend it to simulcast, to more codecs as well, because there might be things that have been not documented very well.
Can you go back a slide?
Yeah.
Please? I think you're counting the audio and video. There are some audio only stats and some video only stats. I think you're counting those as
both,
misses,
yeah,
even if the spec compliant thing would be to have it undefined.
Yeah.
But that's just a few of them. It doesn't change.
It's possible.
The picture.
Am I the only one a little concerned that there are over 300 stats?
No, it's a full dictionary. That's everything, probably data channels and everything. We probably maybe we're overcounting the denominator. Yeah, so everything, not only metrics.
Varun, some of the tests you put in your roadmap, we might have already written, just not put in a public repository. Before you spend any time on it, send me an email. If there is overlap, we will send them to you, put it in public.
Okay, thank you. Karthik, can you reach out? Yeah, so this was just verification, and we're moving on to do some validations because this is also something we promised at last TPAC. Hope we don't have really good results right now, but this is currently in works. And the idea there is that if you set something as 30 frames per second, the idea is, does the stats report 30 frames per second? And you can say oh, if you have a 50 milliseconds delay pipe in between, what is the RTT reporting? Is it 50, 60, 70? And if it's reporting 150, probably it's wrong. So so there will be some validations that we'll add, and we hope to have some good results before the next TPAC for this. So there's more work to be done, and there's more work to be done by the browsers as well. But some of the things that we learned is that the implementations are incomplete, and Like remote stats are missing in Chrome. Most other browsers do not report much. So there's not much to say here. From a developer's perspective, this is frustrating because
I think there are remote stats in Chrome. It's just they don't support the remote ID, so you have to find it with isRemote. Sure.
No, it's with the Promise API, they've removed all the remote stats. In the old API, they had everything.
But incorrectly implemented, some of them.
Yeah.
But close enough.
So irrespective, it makes adoption of some browsers difficult because they don't have all the telemetry. So developers start preferring a certain browser, and that browser might have different telemetry and different features. So it makes this whole thing a lot messier with WebRTC. And so some suggestions for Envy. One of the things that we notice is that people implement features, but then they don't implement stats, or they don't wire up the stats. So maybe we should make stats first-class citizens, like make it in a way that it appears. So I'm not proposing anything right now. It just feels that the stats should be in the same place where you have all the attributes. And then maybe the metrics are developed and implemented simultaneously because it's in their face, it's available, and you need to do it because it's part of the dictionary, either as a component or something. I'm open to suggestion here because I don't really have a good idea right now, but the fact that a lot of stats are not available, and there are, on one hand, you have a lot of stats not available there, but there are also very successful deployments of WebRTC. So it's kind of confusing as to how people are running these large deployments without having all the stats available. Are they on only particular browsers, or something else is happening? And from our own experience, one of the things that we realized was that since peer connection is not available directly, we've had to explicitly ask developers to give us peer connection. And some people, so this is our model, like whoever integrates call stats has to give us peer connection. The other one is people override the peer connection. They load a JavaScript which moves the peer connection to the window, and then they have access to it. This makes it a lot brittle, and I don't think either of these are really good models. At least for us, from a business perspective, it's not a good model, but we would like to explore better ways of doing it. But this is just a side motivation for us. So the alternatives were like stats per object. I think that has been proposed in some cases, like there are stats available within the object. It's an awesome idea, and it also is in line with it's there, so people will implement it. But it's hard to correlate stats across objects, because if you have like 5 objects, like you have a sender, you have a track, and if you have to independently call get stats, you get 5 get stats, but they're all with different timestamps. So I actually don't know if any of that is correlatable, because if things are milliseconds apart or tens of milliseconds apart, you don't know if you actually send a packet. As in you encoded a frame, if that frame has been packetized, you don't know if the packet counters go up or not. So in many cases, this is confusing. So the current get stats, you don't have that kind of problem because you call get stats and you get, in a synchronous way, all the objects return something. And they all have timestamps, so you can at least have some idea of correlation. And with ORTC, there was the stats. I don't know did ORTC have stats gatherer?
Well, it's basically the same stats as what's there today associated with objects.
Okay, so if it doesn't have a stats gatherer, the other thing is that you could have per object stats, but then you could have a stats gatherer which could subscribe to everything, and then you call the stats on the gatherer to like return all the stats, and then maybe you can filter it. And if you're interested in stats of a particular object independently of something, then you could do. So maybe doing both is a way. Any thoughts? Or
just thinking out loud, you could have a get stats on a per object basis, which would just get it independently, and then when you want, then you can do a separate call where you say get stats and then an array of all the objects you're interested in, and then the implementation makes sure they're all synchronized. And
That
it's
would
also
make, that
so
would make sense.
it's in your face, like getStats is part of the interface. You can't implement the
But
feature without.
isn't the first one object.getStats?
Yeah.
And the second one will be getStats with all the
Would
objects.
be, I don't know, some static function where you get stats of these objects, something like that.
Okay.
One particular problem in all these models is that we have stats objects on objects that are not exposed as JavaScript objects, like candidate pairs. So so implicit in saying that we have stats per object goes that we have to expose a lot more objects, if only to get stats from them.
So if the path forward is splitting stuff up into independent components and then trying to synchronize between them, I'm thinking, what if it's more likely that you end up in a deadlock or something like that? But I guess that's details.
Deadlock in what sense?
Like if you have to lock down all the objects because you want the same timestamp for everything, make sure, so you're freezing them all, and then maybe different threads are trying to update these values at the same time.
So I think the heart of the problem that I want to solve is the fact that we don't have that many implementations of the stats. As in, stats have not, the implementation of stats have been not up to date as per the as per even the stats document. So we've done a good job on this on the document, but the implementation's way behind. Even on the MTI.
So, I mean, Yaniva was raising the fact that we have 308 different API hooks to implement. Is it the case that we may be expecting much too soon in this space, or?
But even the status for MTI is really poor. Yeah, it won't be like 5% of 100.
Maybe we could hear from other implementers as to what barriers to implementation. You know, I hear every implementer saying it's a matter of priorities. They can comment on why that's a lesser priority.
We are very reactive on this subject, meaning that anytime somebody comes to us and say, "Hey, I'm missing that stat," we are looking at it, and if we can expose it, usually we expose it. We are not very proactive in a sense that if it's not available through WEBRTC, basically we're not doing things. And it's part of WEBRTC 1.0, so we want to expose these stats at some point, but it's after the other features, basically.
I think one problem is that getStats on a whole is very important, but on a metric by metric basis is well, it depends on the lower layer, but it can feel a bit high effort, low impact. So it's reactive from Chrome's point of view as well. Like if someone is asking for a metric, that's incentive to have it. I think a large problem is the legacy getStats has been out for so long that people are sort of comfortable using it. So what I'm thinking is sort of, it's not spec work. It's I want to add the deprecation warning to the old one. I want to ban anyone adding new data. Like I want to basically force people to start using the new API, and that should add more people asking for more stats too.
So we did that. We moved away from the legacy getStats on Chrome to the new one. And what we've had to do is we call the legacy getStats and backfill everything in the remote stats, because we realized that you have some of those metrics which are available in one API but not the other.
And I think you have to do that in a transition period.
Yeah, so we're doing that.
So I would agree with a lot of that. I mean, Firefox doesn't have that many legacy stats, but we had a couple, and we're trying to remove them and get rid of. We actually have a lot of legacy junk because stats have changed a couple of times that we want to get rid of and clean up. As far as for the long tail of various metrics, same thing. I think we're looking for people and partners and stuff who have interest. It's always easier to implement these things when you have an actual customer that has a need and a specific, and then that helps prioritize upward in the company.
So we have lots of reasons to, like, I guess the takeaway I'll take is that we need to be on the bug trackers of all these browsers and report them.
Yeah, probably. It would be interesting to see if what has been implemented in browsers is roughly the same stats or not. Because if it's not the case, then it means that there might, at least it would be good if it was somehow consistent between browsers. Yeah.
There's some overlap, and there are some browsers which have done additional work which some other browsers have not done. So some people have done a good job in some directions and others have not done. And some metrics which overlap are good, but then, so for example, round trip time has been implemented by some browsers, but not by others, which makes it a bit like round trip time is the most important metric, I would say, for many people. Jitter is another. And the implementation status of those metrics is also disputable in many places, like they're not available, which.
Another challenge is testing these things. So if you're asking what would help us implement things more easily, having existing web platform tests that actually correctly detect that a stat is there would probably help, and returns useful values.
Right. Some stats are easy to test on a one-by-one basis. Some of the stats actually change across time or accumulate and aggregate and so on. So the WPT will not be able to test all of them, actually. We have added a lot of GetStat support, but again, the variation between the browser make it difficult to test it across. And the lack of network instrumentation for us that actually Costa.io has, so they can see more stuff, makes it also very difficult because you need to control what you send to the baseline to check if GetStat is reporting the right thing.
So this is where we wanted to bring, that's one of the reasons why we're exposing even the validation, is to allow for people to just subscribe and get reports weekly, monthly, whatever, or on new updates of browsers. And that was because we're in the process of like exposing a lot of this instrumentation externally. We've also, I think we are now working with Kite on making sure that we're able to use Kite and Kite's able to use something along the same lines. So more on that will come.
It's a long laundry list.
Yes, I agree. A lot of stats are difficult to test, but it's also goes into prioritizing. And to implement a feature, we also want to have tests so that we don't write new code that will break later.
We did merge the PR to isolate stats tests to their own directory. I merged that yesterday. So at least we know where to put them, and it's easier to find them instead of routing through all the other tests. Once we move the test, it's easy to find that is.
But web platform test-wise, it might be difficult to test all these packet stats.
A lot, and we will need to go stat by stat, but a couple of them from the top of my head. There are some stats that are about the remote peer. There are some stats that are influenced by the network between the local and the remote. So if you do it like within a tab with 2 peer connection, you do not represent all the possible case. So some of the stats can only be really meaningfully tested on an end-to-end basis, and some of the stats also need variation across time. So with the control.
With the WPT, you can at least show that the dictionary value is is there, and that the value in the context of WT makes some sense. So at least you would get some coverage, and at least for us, what we are doing is exposing what WEBRTC is doing. So it would be good to validate that WEBRTC is doing well. But okay, so that's really nice.
You want to comment on the WEBRTC stat test in WPT since you wrote them?
Yeah, I agree. Hello. Yeah, I agree that we can add more tests to it because currently the stats in the WPT, they are pretty basic. Like they only test for like the existence of the fields and the correct types. But we haven't really verified that from both they have sensible values.
So you test the idea, or you test that all the dictionary out there or not, and all the kind of test. Some of the stats that are actually testable in the way. But you also concluded when you wrote this test that some of them won't be thoroughly tested that way, correct?
I think even if you can't test, like you can test that something makes sense. There was a bug where some byte counter included the header payload or something when it shouldn't. And I think that level where exact number of bytes, that might not be testable in web platform tests, but you could set up a test and let's say you have a canvas-based track. You can check the counters and then produce one new frame, and you know that you might not know exactly how many bytes or packets are going to be sent, but you know that this counter should go up.
There's byte received and byte sent.
So how
they should somehow match, especially in page to page.
So you can make sure they match on the both sides, and you can make sure that if a counter should go up, it goes up.
So
and then
I would not want to debate more on this because I think we already have done a lot of work here. So when we come out with the validation, you'll see some of these results, and we'll have some caveats there. So, so I'm sure like not everyone's on the same page on this. Like different systems, different tools out there. We're of course trying to make sure that these tools are generally available, and if not, at least the results are generally available.
I think it would be interesting to see at TPAC some concrete information about which stats are supported in which browser and with what level of support and or validation. I mean,
on the validation, it's not there, but if you go to the URL on the previous page, you can, if you go there, it will expand all of them, and you can actually see per stat the status across browsers.
So what I know is that for on WPT side, when you get the results, you can see for each browser what is supported, what is green and what is red. And if you see, like, for instance, there are 3 green and just 1 red, you might say, hey, maybe the priority is a little bit higher on this one.
So you can see this.
So some things like that, yeah.
And as we go down, then you can see that the implementations are not exactly the same here.
Right.
There are counts here which.
And if we have the same results for recent versions of Edge and Safari, then we might conclude that, oh, Safari is missing one that everybody has. It sucks a lot, and that would put some pressure on Safari. Tim?
Just a side note, but I think there's a hierarchy of these stats objects. I think some of these stats are counted probably 4 times, which might make the count slightly less scary, but I think it's a ballpark figure, correct?
Yeah, and we also did try to make sure that it's only one side sending audio, only one. That's why it's audio only and video only, so that you don't get this plethora of stats from both sides. And for some of the things that were about network testing, you can easily do like hairpinning through a turn server and bring it back, and you can control the link to the turn server. So there are ways that we've already come forward on some of this testing of network and variable situations, which we hope that when we release the validation results, it should become easier. But that takes us away from like my original question, like we are, as if I understood correctly, we are reactive as a community to build more stats. And now that we're thinking about doing NV, we're already aware of this. So how do we like make sure that we do not do this in NV? Like, how do we make sure that we implement, like both implement and think about stats from the beginning? Because that's the other thing that we did was we started on stats much later as compared to the peer connection object, like the peer connection spec.
I think, so usually, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, but usually there's a counter that goes up when something happens. And I mean, that should be part of the description of the interface. Like it's part of the operation that it's doing. If it's doing something in the background, then it should say, when this happened, increase this counter. And then get stats should just be a matter of take these values that you already have, and they are these, whatever the variables, slots, as they are called in the spec. You say, you return the value of these slots. There you go.
Right.
And then you can't get around it, because it's bad when it says here's the entire feature, and then there's a separate document that says that doesn't go into detail about how you actually calculate these things. It just says like, oh yeah, this should be the packet counter, and it's the first occurrence of a packet counter.
Right, and that's one of my things as a consumer of GetStats. I'm happy that our document has like all this big coverage in terms of it covers a lot of scope. But what I'm kind of unhappy because I'm not the person who's implementing it. I'm like looking for guidance as one of the co-authors of the document is what can we do better? And if it means that we make it more in the face, that's probably the right thing to do.
Yeah, but that would mean putting it in the same spec, which
that is fine.
And but like treat a metric like you treat the signaling state. Like it's very well defined where it's updated.
Any more thoughts?
Set.
All right, then the stage is back to, oh, actually, experimental stats, if you wanted to discuss that, or people have opinions about experimental stats. How do we enable or disable or run them?
So this is the problem we have where one version is we have to measure something, but we don't know how to measure it yet. So we can't write specs for it. The other version is we want to try out this thing, and if it works, we'll just put it into production, and if it doesn't work, we'll just forget about it. But the way we want to measure it is something that will never be standardized. But we want to expose it in the stats interface. Both of these are real issues that we have encountered.
And there's the issue of at what point can applications start coding in support for this? If applications code in support for experimental stuff, unless they're fairly well synced with the experimental implementations, you can get into some interesting problems, which is to be expected. They're experimental, but it's something that if people aren't careful, you'll end up with applications in the field that have simply ignored the fact that it's experimental and assume it's never going to change.
Right. Usually you have any experiment has like 2 applications that are really part of the experiment and can be relied on to track what's going on, and 15 applications that might discover the value and say, oh, this looks useful, we'll just record it or act on it or whatever. And the last one is what standards are supposed to prevent.
I thought that was what Origin Trial was trying to ensure, that only people that commit to follow the updates to the proposal get access to the proposed values.
Yes, so origin trials is one of our internal answers, but origin trials are not standards.
Yeah, but I think I think having it in the standard or exposing it in any way by default would be a mistake. Then they stick around. And it also gives people an easy way where they, oh, let's try out this value. And they add it and it sort of makes sense. And then like, well, they already have the value now. So why bother continuing the standardization effort? Like, no, it shouldn't be available unless you have to do something like origin trial or like guard the web, solve the spec, and then release it.
So for the second one, I'm thinking if it's a well-defined metric and we don't know how useful it is, why wouldn't we just go ahead and put it in the spec? Because it's well-defined, it might not be of use. People may not implement it. Not all browsers will implement it, and some might, and it might never go away. The first one's what is more is more harmful because we do not know how to measure something and we do not know how useful it would be. And that's the one I would imagine is an origin trial or something like that. But the second one, unless I miswrote it here.
I'm less worried about stats that well defined. So let's add it whether or not it's useful, and then you can always remove it later, whether or not. Well, I guess you can. The problem is you can't deprecate a stat the way you deprecate a function or an interface. Like there's no deprecation warning. We have no idea how much stats are used. They're all just dictionaries.
Yeah, and we have had that issue with, for example, with round trip time, and I think the original one had a bad metric in it. It was in milliseconds, and then I think Firefox needed to change it, and it took a while. So given that experience, I would not want to do that again. Deprecating a known metric is hard, especially if there's a bug or something like that in it.
Yeah, I mean, we're blind. It's like we can try removing it and seeing if someone screams, but
someone's going to scream, but most likely not at you.
And we don't want like just the list to keep growing with these sort of temporary stats. We don't want to have to maintain 300, 400, 500 stats.
Well, some of them have been standardized 20 years ago, so hopefully you don't have to maintain them. If they've implemented correctly. Otherwise, it's a bug in the metric.
Would we? I mean, it would be breaking. But if we end up with new get stats functions on a per object basis, could we define it as an interface with a getter? So you could actually feature detect, and you could have use counters, and you can. I don't know if it helps the bigger picture.
Maybe it's a discussion to have with Envy and their independent objects to think about stats for those independent objects and see. Do we have a spec right now which is creating an extension object? ICE?
Sorry.
Yeah, is there an extension spec for a new object? For Envy? What do you do for
Sorry, I was going to jump back to the earlier point. Just to Henrik's point, the RTC stats report interface is a map like of DOM string and object, which means technically you could add getters. We've tried to, and there's some limitations on our end that we couldn't do that. But in theory, there's nothing in the spec that prevents you from using getters. But even getters are hard because you have to deal with libraries that might, JSON stringify all your stats.
And you don't want to mix two formats in the same call. Yes.
Yeah, so it should be possible to detect some use. But I also agree that I'm also, and I guess I hesitate to ask, but if we wanted to deprecate some of these stats to make the list shorter and more, that would be the time.
We do that by only having some MTI.
Yeah, we do have a section in the spec called obsolete stats where we move everything that is considered useless, which is we kind of think that once you've used up a name, you burn that name forever. Once the stat name has been in the spec, it's used up. You can't use it again. So anything that's not useful, we move into obsolete stats.
We could, of course, bring it back if people thought it made sense again.
Right, but you can't easily change the definition.
Yeah, definition cannot be changed at all. You can bring it back with the same definition.
Or a clarified definition. But you cannot like, we had this silly volume stat that was a number between 0 and 32,300 and something. And without the defined mapping to decibels. That one is just gone. You can never recover it.
Yeah, and I think we had the same problem with RTT. It was in milliseconds as opposed to seconds, and we replaced it with round trip time. Only the discerning eye catches it, but we did not overload the same definition, like overload the same variable with or stat with a different definition. No more thoughts, so I guess I take an action point to work with this ice and quick and see if we can get some stats there already, if they aren't already there.
That's cool. Okay. So it has been pointed out that so there's a bunch of missing things. So we thought we would try to fill in that portion of the discussion and also summarize a little bit of what we've talked about so far. So in this meeting, we've talked about the following aspects. So Peter talked about API levels. I think the general interest was in B or perhaps C. B is roughly the level of ORTC and C is a little bit below. We have talked about end-to-end security, and discussion of that is ongoing. We've talked about quick, and I think it is fair to say there is no consensus about that, at least yet. We talked about RTP transport and wanted to talk more about it. So I think it's accurate to say there's no consensus about that. The encoder and transport separation, I think there's no consensus about that. We've talked about data channel objects. That seems to have consensus because it's already in WEBRTC 1.0 and nobody wanted to rip it out. So it stays. ICE, we had some enthusiasm for flex ICE extensions, which is, but that was largely for use with quick. Nothing else. We didn't define anything else that could use it. And then we talked about scalable video coding, mostly for WEBRTC 1.0. Not yet. I'm just trying to summarize what we've talked about so far. But if we're talking about an object model, there are other things that weren't talked about. So we haven't really talked about the RTP sender or receiver. I haven't talked about DTLS transport or other objects on this. What? Yeah, standalone SCTP transport. Good point. Or standalone RTC data channel built on that in the way. So kind of the overall picture has not been filled in. We've just been mostly talking about what we don't agree about. So the question is, are there things that have not been discussed that we actually do agree on doing? And some of those I've separated into ORTC has some mandatory to implement stuff and some optional stuff. So examples of mandatory things are RTP sender, RTP receiver, DTLS transport, RTC data channel, SCTP transport, of course, ICE transport is also mandatory. And in the case of ORTC, also the gatherer. Then there's some optional things. The RTP listener is optional. But oddly enough, if you look at that section, it actually describes how RTP and RTCP packets are routed. And there's actually a very nasty little section because it's actually even more complicated to specify than bundle, the equivalent section. You're basically trying to get the same result as bundle, so you're compatible with WEBRTC 1.0. And there seem to be a bunch of different ways to do it. And it's been implemented differently with similar results to bundle, but maybe not exactly the same. So it's an optional section with lots of mandatory things in it. And then the ice transport controller, which we described, relates to freezing, which we seem to have lived well without, and nobody seems to miss it. So, some questions for the group. So through our discussion so far, we've mostly learned what we don't have consensus about. But the question is, do we have consensus on the things we've not talked about? And do we want to move forward on aspects of WebRTC that NB that we haven't talked about that we just described? And potential answers are yes, not now but soon, or never. We'll never do this. And so we wanted to solicit opinions of the group on whether we should even talk about the things we haven't talked about.
So if you go back a slide,
yeah,
those 6 things there, I think that a few of them I had on my slides, but we just got derailed into other topics. But my opinion would be that we should take those 6 things, and then we can discuss further whether to break down the send and receiver into smaller pieces that you can pull out. And then, of course, flex ice is just an extension of the ice transport. And some of the things that was brought up for SCTP could be added to that transport. But the ORTC versions of these that you can construct them and deal with them directly, I think that we should adopt all of those. And I think that we should just ignore those optional things at the bottom.
So no routing of packets.
Yeah.
So
the packets just drop in the bit bucket.
And I had some slides over in more detail with some of those, but
so just to be clear, basically so some of these objects already exist in WebRTC 1.0. So what you're saying is actually, hey, let's add some constructors, maybe some new methods or new getters, or to be exactly like ORTC, or?
Well, it doesn't have to, in the end, doesn't have to be exactly like it, but the question is whether you start from that and go from there. I mean, basically, WebRTC 1.0 has all of the mandatory objects are already in it. It doesn't have the optional ones. It doesn't have the ice transport controller because it doesn't need it. It doesn't have the listener because it specifies the routing in bundle. The reason the routing is important is because the routing in WebRTC 1.0 is dependent on SDP. And once you take that away, it's not clear how the packets go anywhere. So you've kind of taken away the mechanism by which you route packets to the sender and receiver. And so if you don't replace that somehow, there aren't any packets that actually get delivered. And that generally is considered a problem.
So I'm not an expert on ORTC, unfortunately. Could you explain a little bit how, without SDP, how do you do signaling, stuff like that?
Yeah, sure. Let me just bring up the spec. Okay. So the diagram's not a bad place to start because basically the way, actually I should probably do it from the slide because it's a little bit bigger. The concept in ORTC is that the sender and receiver have capabilities as they do in WebRTC 1.0. In fact, it's 90% the same capabilities. And that tells you what the object can do. And then you configure it with what you want it to do out of those capabilities. So for example, it'll have, just like it has in 1.0, it'll have like a list of codecs. In addition to, in ORTC, it has a list of the parameters, like I support profile level ID, stuff like that. And so you you advertise these capabilities, and then you get to set things within the limits of the capabilities. So that's how the sender and receiver work. Like WebRTC 1.0, most of the capabilities are on the sender. The receiver just kind of sits there. In fact, your clarification, Jan-Ivar, on the decoding and encoding parameters and send and receive was very helpful, because it was never, just like WebRTC 1.0, it wasn't all that clear what the receiver did. And once you really got into it, the answer is it doesn't do that much. And it doesn't need to. It kind of sits there and receives stuff. So it doesn't need a whole lot of parameters. But basically, it's the same. It's largely the same set of encoding parameters as are in WebRTC 1.0, with the exception of the SVC stuff, which we just talked about, which is there and isn't at the moment in 1.0. So the way these things go is today in WebRTC 1.0, you basically vend senders and receivers that have these things attached to them. And so you get a sender and you can find its DTLS transport and find its ICE transport. In ORTC, you build it up from the bottom. So typically what you'll do is you'll create an ICE gatherer. And very often when you hook it up, it's not gathering. You hook up the pipeline first, because if you hook it up first, then you kind of guarantee that packets won't leak out the sides. They'll have places to go in the pipeline. So you'll create an ICE transport object, and then you pass that ICE transport object to the DTLS transport, create that attached to an ICE transport, and then you'll attach a sender or receiver to the DTLS transport. So you essentially construct these objects rather than having the chain done for you. And then once you've got them constructed, you can basically do an equivalent of offer answer if that's what you want to do. You take the parameters and you can pass it in any form you want. You could create SDP if you want to do that, or you could just create JSON and basically send the equivalent stuff. The negotiation can be done in any style. It can be done SDP offer answer, but you also have other potential ways of doing it. And one way we've seen that's become quite popular is more akin to what was done in H323, where you have an intersection of capabilities. So you actually don't signal parameters. You take the capabilities and like the ICE and DTLS stuff, like the fingerprints, package that up, send it to the other side, and then you do an intersection of the codecs. Say, what codecs do I have in common? And derive essentially the sending parameters. And if you read through the ORTC spec, there's actually an intersection code that's been written by FIPO that describes how that's done. And so that's kind of been a very popular way of doing the signaling, which is more similar to the H323 style. So there's, if you look through, I can give you example code on how, kind of what it looks like. So let's go through.
Bernard?
Yeah, go ahead. Hi, Ben.
Yeah, hi. Is it fair to say that basically the way ORTC works is that both sides just need to be configured? How you decide what you want to configure both sides to is up to you. And, you know, presumably you're going to collect capabilities information from both sides. But again, in the end, they just independently get configured, essentially.
Yeah, that's basically true. Of course, you still have the same obligation to configure them consistently.
Right.
So,
but I mean, as opposed to offer answer.
Yeah, if you're just going to do the offer answer, basically what you would do is you take these capabilities. There's functions that FIPO has written to convert them to SDP. So you take your capabilities and stuff, call the SDP function, it generates the SDP, you send it to the other side, you get an answer back, and then FIPO has something that converts the SDP to parameters. So then you can push it down if that's the style you happen to want. So for example, in adapter.js, they have basically a complete implementation of peer connection on top of these objects. And they basically just try to mimic what was done really in the add stream, remove stream API. There are pieces of it with add track, remove track. They haven't done the transceiver section. And there are some things we've learned from add transceiver that how to make minor changes, because remember within ORTC, the goal was to actually have complete compatibility with RTC peer connection. So that's still a goal. And so as things change in the WEBRTC 1.0 spec, things change in ORTC as well.
So here's a question, and I don't know the answer to this, so I'm asking. Doing the capabilities and other things like that in this manner, what impact? We've talked a lot about the two user case. What impact does this have in SFU-like cases and in cases where you have not necessarily an SFU, but you have something that's brokering a mesh of peer-to-peer connections, like in a game?
Now that's a great question, because the kind of capabilities exchange I've just described is not necessarily all that suited for an SFU case, because the idea is to take the intersection. So as an example, if it's just me and you talking, Randall, you know, the fact that you can do 3 streams of temporal and 3 streams of spatial, and doesn't necessarily imply, and I can also send you that, doesn't necessarily imply that it makes any sense for us to do that in a one-to-one conversation.
Right.
So in the example function, we don't attempt to intersect that to figure out the simulcast case, because it doesn't make sense to do that. So at least the examples that are written so far use that kind of intersection mostly for the simple peer-to-peer case, where it's just easy. You want an audio and a video stream, and then you take the intersection and get that. So it's kind of the simple case. But so for the simulcast case, basically you'd have to decide how many streams you wanted to do. You could still take the intersection, and that would give you the codecs that you have available and stuff like that. But then you'd have to go in and add things to the intersection to suit what you want to do. So as an example, you could have an intersection that could tell you could send up to 5 streams, but that wouldn't necessarily mean you want to do that.
Yeah.
So there's a even simpler case that kind of interests me, which is that if you're talking to a hardware device, a doorbell or something, and you're writing a JavaScript as a manufacturer for that, you know pretty much everything about it. There are actually only, I think, 4 things you don't know. You don't know the ICE password. You don't know you might even know the fingerprint, but you probably don't.
Right.
And and you probably want to set the SSRC.
Right.
But like beyond that, you already know everything. There's no negotiation needed. You built the damn thing. You know what codecs it does. You know how many streams it is.
Yeah, so it isn't mandatory to do any of these things, like you said. If you already know that the other side, it's your device talking to your device, you know what the codecs it supports, you can just slam it right in there.
Yeah, and I'm not concerned about, and that makes sense given the ORTC API, that it would simplify cases like that, and that's great for those cases. What I'm just trying to make sure of is that it doesn't paint other use cases into something of a more complex corner than they would need to be in. And that's why I was asking about some of the not only the SFU case, which you just spoke to, but also some of the brokering connections sorts of cases where you're not talking directly to an SFU that's in an intermediary, but you're using a central server as a broker for connections. And my example that from long ago use cases was a mesh peer-to-peer game where it's primarily data, maybe with some optional video at times, or audio, and perhaps audio as well. But you want to optimize connection time and avoid unnecessary round trips creating stuff. So you like to have the broker already know about the capabilities or the offer or whatever from one side.
But Randall and Bernard, should we perhaps try to up level a little bit, because we don't want to have a masterclass on ORTC here.
Right. So kind of to go back to the original question, if I remember it. So the original question was, so we've learned about what we don't have consensus about, but is the group interested in moving forward on aspects of ORTC and B that were not discussed? And namely, Peter put forward, this list of the mandatory stuff and propose not doing the optional.
So when we discussed on the mailing list, there seems to be consensus on moving away from the SDP model. So that's one thing. There might be a concern that it's not sufficient enough to justify the cost of implementing new things. But I think that at least if we want to move away from SDP, this seems natural to, and we already made that decision somehow because we introduced those objects in WebRTC 1.0 and it's complementary. So to me,
we've introduced them, we have not yet implemented them, to be clear.
That's right.
But to the extent that, WebRTC minus SDP equals ORTC, I guess that's a natural way to increment. I guess it's hard to know.
It's pretty close. I'd say WebRTC 1.0 is at least 80% of the functionality of ORTC. It also has 80% of the, ORTC has 80% of the bugs of WebRTC 1.0. So whenever you file a bug on 1.0, you're 80% of the time you're also filing a bug on ORTC. So that's something to keep in mind, in that I guess you could say it's better to work on both because you'd have one bug database instead of two. And then you could say it's an ORTC bug in addition to a 1.0 bug and have one bug. But that's
so as an incremental step. Yeah, I think it looks great. I guess the only hesitation will be if for next version, it's always hard to know. Is that the only thing? Is that radical enough? Or I mean, barring any other proposals, that seems like a good way to go.
I can give you my opinion, which is that developers are a very interesting set of people because they will go through hell if there's a rainbow on the other side, no matter what's in between. So people used to say, oh, the WebRTC 1.0 API, it's so horrible, it's got OLS SDP, it's so bad, blah, 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 blah. But people build a lot of very complicated stuff and they hopefully make a living at it and they got it to work. So if you tell them, oh, I've got a much better way of doing it that does exactly the same thing as the other thing did, if assuming their code already works, they'll say, well, it's very nice, but my manager doesn't pay me to rewrite all of my code to make it nicer. In general, that's a kind of characteristic I've learned in life that, unless the thing has completely fallen apart and been given up for dead, you're not going to get a manager to let you rewrite it.
So I guess for WebRTC and the idea is to extend a little bit the use cases. You were saying that ORTC might be, WebRTC 1.0 might be 80% of the use case, but ORTC. So it seems to extend it a little bit. So
so we've agreed to extend, ORTC does SVC, which WebRTC 1.0 does not, but we've agreed to extend 1.0 to do the SVC. So with that, you would be at 90%. The remaining 10% is the ICE gatherer, which allows you to do forking. I think we had a bunch of discussion. I don't recall whether we decided forking was, I don't think anybody said forking was terribly important. Some people may have liked it or not liked it, but you're kind of already at 90%. So that's kind of one of the reasons we've been having this discussion about new use cases, is because my personal experience has been that you have to have something not just cooler, but actually substantive in terms of business opportunity that some manager will say, and that could only be done this way, because you know that if it can be done through 1.0 by hook or crook, the manager will say, just do it in 1.0 and be done with it.
And speaking exactly to that point, if it's possible to do in 1.0 in a reliable fashion, you're certainly going to have better coverage and better deployment, because people have 1.0 and the new stuff they don't necessarily have yet, and if they do, it's maybe iffy in some implementations. So
also to be clear, we don't even quite have 1.0 yet.
Yeah.
And the parts of 1.0 we don't have, right? We do have a complete implementation of ORTC, which is ORTC Lib. It's much more complete than Edge. So I think we can say that the ORTC model hasn't really been completely implemented in any browser, even in 1.0 or not 1.0.
Right. And so, so I agree with you. This is driven by the use cases. Driven by new, in particular, new use cases or extensions of use cases, or needing extra reliability in use case or whatever.
So
Right.
correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I see it is for other features that we've discussed, this is sort of an unblocker, like getting rid of peer connection allows us to split up transport more. Like it allows us to split things up, which allows more features. But in and of itself, why bother? Is there anything other than you don't have to do SDP? Like, what's the big selling point?
Well, so the major use cases that we've seen that we were able to do in ORTC that we could not do in WEBRTC 1.0 was gaming related. So ORTC today, if you actually look at where it's used, its overwhelming uses in gaming, in native kind of games. And the reason it's so much more popular in that realm is largely because of the ICE features, which help the games get started quicker, like for mesh games. And also, there are certain ICE mobility features which were implemented that were very popular for mobile games. So we implemented turn mobility, so the person could go between Wi-Fi hotspots and keep the game going. So that was kind of the kind of mobile focus, and the games focus is really where the activity is today. So that was a very specific, the kind of gaming use case specifically.
Could that not be done with the peer connection?
No, it could not. It was attempted and could not be done with peer connection.
So the ICE part of that, because this is actually goes, in fact, that use case exactly, in fact, I sort of implied that a minute ago. That use case goes directly back to one we'd talked about early on in WebRTC, which was something acting as a broker for connections, which is effectively forking. Okay?
Right, forking.
Yeah, you're effectively putting an offer out there, and you could have multiple people responding to it.
Right.
Okay, and originally that was something we were actually concerned about. The real question is, where did that? How did that end up not being possible in WebRTC 1.0, and what piece is missing that makes it not possible?
Yeah, so I mean, the overall, it actually, forking turned out to be a little bit of a complex thing. We underestimated what would be needed in ORTC, but basically, the important thing about forking is it's not just about ICE.
Mm-hmm.
It turned about, if you think about it, you're sending out this offer and getting multiple answers. That offer includes ICE stuff, but it also includes fingerprints. So you're basically saying you're creating DTLS transports with the same certificate as in your offer. So we had to support forking in the DTLS transport as well. And the thing is, basically what you have to be able to do is create multiple ICE transports with the same ICE credentials, but with different remote credentials. That's
right.
kind of the requirement for that forking piece.
Yes.
Forking doesn't, as far as I can tell, it doesn't affect anything other than the ICE transport and the DTLS transport. You know, it doesn't affect the sender or the receiver,
okay,
or the data channel or anything else. But
so the biggest concern with doing that, the biggest blocker doing that is the certificate issue.
Well, basically, if you look at the constructor of DTLS transport, it takes certificates, and in the forking case, those certs would be you'd basically be creating multiple DTLS transports with the same certs, like
right. I'm saying in 1.0, okay. In
1.0, so Harold, I guess in 1.0, if you wanted to do that, you could pass the same search to multiple.
Because the application does the application pass the cert in? No.
Yes. Well, the application can pass the cert in peer connection constructor.
Yeah.
So that part is fine.
We have this gigantic, or no, small API for creating certs and storing them in storage. Right. That was created exactly for this purpose.
So yeah, 1.0 works fine with the DTLS part of it. And I guess the problem is when you create multiple peer connections, they'll each have different ICE creds.
Right. There's no way to have.
Yeah, you can't have the same ICE creds. That's the problem.
With the same localized candidates.
So that's the piece that's missing then, is the ICE creds.
As the ICE creds.
Well, no, it's also sharing the local candidates.
Right. You have to share the same, right? Because that's you have to share the same local candidates, and not have in each peer connection that you created.
Right. And like trying to make that.
So reusing the ICE transport, or no, not the. Never mind.
trying to make that work with the peer connection off ramps, or I just
right. So that's not to say, Randall, that I wouldn't say games is like, it is an industry of sorts. I'm not saying it's like the preoccupation of every browser vendor or you know, what everyone spends all their time on, but it is a niche that happened to care about these things.
No, and it was part of our original, our original concerns with this, though from the W3 side of things, we're concerned with the web interface to this, as opposed to people who are coding directly directly onto the wire in an app.
Yeah, I mean, they do overlap.
Though interop between them is potentially an issue.
To that point, I wouldn't underestimate the surprise you see on the faces of web developers when they first see the peer connection API and the SDP. It's about a week before they kind of even start talking to you again. I know they will do it, and if they're sufficiently motivated, they'll get through to the other end. But it costs me every time I have to do it.
Yeah, I mean, you generally lose about a week, but these are people who like been doing this all their life, and it's like, hey, a week out of my life to, as long as they basically, as long as they can do the game there, it's amazing what they'll do. You could probably create bogus APIs and they'd learn them even if they made no sense.
But I claim there's a bunch of projects that never happened because people looked at it and thought, oh, to hell with it, I'll do it another way.
Yeah, I was gonna, when somebody said, oh, it's just not having to use SDP, that's a pretty big just.
Yeah.
Not only for people that are first trying to use the data channel, which, if we had the ICE and DTLS and SDP transport, it's fairly straightforward without SDP.
Generally, what we found is the games developers who've already written to WEBRTC 1.0 continue to do so. And the ones who are greenfield are the ones who use ORTC. Like they're just writing a new game, they'll all 100% go to ORTC. But if they've been using 1.0, they'll continue to do it with all the new games because they're kind of used to it already.
Yeah.
And they're generally happy with it. There's nothing that they feel is missing particularly, other than the gather, the whole forking thing. Yeah, but there's a bunch of games that don't care about forking too, I should say.
Right. So I'm not necessarily saying that doing these is a bad idea. I'm just trying to understand from the point of view of what use cases are we enabling that were not enabled before. Okay. What this work is buying us. Okay. Yeah, and the answer is more than just getting away from SDP. The question is how much more.
I mean, and part of the reason why we had all this use case discussion with all of these use cases is we were attempting to develop a substantial portfolio of things that we could sell beyond just forking, to try to address these additional industries or whatever, to the point where you'd say, yeah, we've got some gaming, but we've also got files and we've got this and we've got that, to kind of make it a more attractive package, instead of just saying, basically, if you're not a hardcore gamer, you're not going to care about it.
Okay. Then we have SDP removal, which is sort of a indirect use case. Okay. Because most don't care about it. We have some of the forking issues that are enabled by the ICE stuff, though there are other ways those could be addressed. What other use cases are, significant use cases are we enabling that are not enabled now? So
we've seen some interest in very high volume conferencing. So kind of educational, like 1,000-person or more conferences.
Really distribution with optional back channel type thing.
Right. And the reason they're interested in it is because they'll have, for example, 3,000 students, 99% of which never send.
Yep.
So they like the idea of just creating a receiver and no sender. And that dramatically simplifies their programming of that very large kind of conference. I wouldn't say there are a million companies doing this because it's kind of a relatively restricted niche. And there are only 1 or 2 people who try to, support that use case. But those have seen benefits from being able to instantiate a receiver with no sender.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would
why-
suggest, I would suggest that the biggest advantage and biggest issue in those cases is how you handle the encryption and the forking of all the media and all that sort of stuff. That's where the real pain in that scenario is, not so much the building a receive only peer connection or receive only, receiver.
Yeah, I don't know. Those people I've talked to, often the conferences are not. Some of them do involve PSDN, and that's a whole another level of complexity and interoperation with SOTP SDES and all that. A lot of them seem to be internet only, so which simplifies it a bit.
Yeah, I'm just saying that I don't see that the creating the receiver side of this application is in any way the gating issue for that application. Okay.
Yeah, and to be fair, they have implemented these things with WEBRTC 1.0.
Yeah,
they just have basically a receive-only transceiver.
Yeah, it seems like trivial.
It's not like it's not impossible. It's just they felt it scaled a little better. And
I don't understand why, but okay.
Well, just because they don't have all the additional objects to deal with, particularly if you're receiving new streams, depending on how they do it, it can add a little complexity just to manage the direction of the transceivers. I'm not saying this is like a huge issue because they have done it. So it's not, I wouldn't say that this is enabling that where it wasn't doable before.
Okay.
But it's just a little bit easier.
Okay. So what else do we have?
I'm more interested in new use cases. I mean, if it's 1 year of work and then, we don't have to have this center.
Yeah. Well, that was kind of all the things Peter
I'm
been
going over
talking about,
I'm
right?
kind of rehashing the conversation from yesterday, but I'm going over my slides again. And, one of them is the end-to-end encryption, which depends on how we end up doing it. If it were all done in the browser, then theoretically it could be done with peer connection.
Yeah.
If it's something we want the app to be able to step in and work with, then
and that is,
perhaps not.
as an example, that is something that is deployed today in the financial industry. So that's, you're basically, the way I'm looking at this is I'm looking at little niches. So you've got gaming with the end-to-end, you have some financial people using this, with the file transfer, you have some other things. And hopefully at the end of the day, when you kind of look at all these things, you've got something substantial enough to convince your engineering manager to let you work on it, basically, right?
Sure, but the thing we're talking there is moving to RTC, and if almost all extensions are backported to WebRTC 1.0, that does not give a lot of credit.
Sure,
to
but
RTC.
yeah, some of the things can be backported, some probably can't. Like we said we're going to do the SVC stuff because it's being used, so why not? It's being used in 1.0. I think the things that really we didn't propose to be done in 1.0 was like some of the use cases Peter talked about.
There's ice forking and quick.
And quick. And the media over quick, frankly, is a use case that then begins to engage entertainment. So that's kind of that's a pretty big industry, probably bigger than all the ones we talked about before, and kind of would be enough to motivate it if that was, use case to do. So, and being over quick would kind of mean it would be an NV thing rather than a 1.0 thing.
I mean, you understand where I'm going to. I mean, potentially there's a fair bit of work here, modulo the fact that a lot of it's been done on RTC, so it's largely copying and then and updating and tweaking.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to see, where are we getting a significant advantage versus say doing a extension spec for whatever to handle the same thing like we're doing for the SVC and so forth. So
I don't see a clear distinction between extension spec and NV. I mean, the form of the spec is a different question from what the functionality should be.
My point was an extension spec that it extends the existing model as opposed to the breaking it all apart into a bunch of different objects spec, a part of the spec.
Really what we're saying is it worth it to have constructors for these objects? So you can construct them without a peer connection.
Right.
Yeah.
And in some cases, quick ice forking, the answer is yes, you need to.
Yeah. Well, I think you could do the ice forking without doing that, but yeah, okay.
I remain to be convinced.
Yeah.
Yeah, you'd have to make some change. You'd have to make a change. It'd have to be an extension spec, but I think you could absolutely do it.
And then we still had a lot of discussion around the end-to-end encryption and also the ability to do audio, video, and data over the same congestion control context, which, later we're going to talk about the RTP data channel again. And that, depending on how it's implemented, might be a lot easier with something constructed outside of peer connection. And of course, quick.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some things we can do without constructors and some things that is much easier with constructors.
Is it fair to say that the difference is adding a few constructors and a few get set parameters type of stuff?
Yes. I mean, I've shown the diff of this at TPAC previously, and I had some slides to describe some of them today. But yeah, it's some constructors.
A lot
and
less
some extra
scary.
methods.
Yeah, in terms of new methods, and the existing objects that are already in 1.0, which have, let's be clear, have not all been implemented completely. But the diff of the new methods isn't that much. You do have the constructors, but overall it is a new API, which implies that you have to kind of document things for developers. You have to talk to them. It is like adding a new API like any other WebRTC API. There's a documentation thing you have to do with developer relations.
Tests.
So, if you haven't realized this, your engineering manager will definitely tell you that there's a certain amount of effort involved.
So from the implementation standpoint, libWebRTC maps quite closely to the components below. So
right,
it's mostly kind of the JavaScript to C++ binding we're talking about.
Yeah. So, there is a code base out, fully functional code base out there if you want to look at it. It's called ORTC Lib. It's got all this stuff, all the C++ objects in it already. So you can get a sense. It's already built on the existing Chrome media engine, so you don't need to change anything there. And of course, there's also ORTC factory in Chrome if you want to look at that similar kind of thing. So we're back to the question. Is the group interested in moving forward on aspects of WebRTC NB? And I had 3 answers up there: yes, not now, but soon, or never. Or at least not within the charter.
I'll repeat my yes.
What?
I'll repeat yes.
Okay.
I said so earlier, but I'll repeat it.
Speaking for myself personally only, I will support moving forward with any spec that has an editor that can commit resources to it.
Oh, okay. Spoken as a true chair.
That was me as a developer.
That was you, right?
I mean, if you can't find an editor, then it's not interesting enough to do.
Yeah.
If you can find an editor, I don't see a reason for waiting.
Any other opinions?
I think yes. I think yes.
Who's that?
Shim, AKN, Shim. I think
Okay.
yes. Mhm.
Any other opinions? Randall?
Well, I mean, I want to be certain that we're actually buying something with this, because we're going to buy into a whole new raft of WPT tests.
Exactly.
Oh boy. Especially as you start getting more and more interactions, because
Dr. Alex is very interested in that. More tests.
Yeah, the more objects you create and the more ways you can interconnect them, you get the exponential increase in the number of tests required.
And potentially interrupt bugs as well.
Yes.
Hopefully, the good thing is that it shipped and it's used elsewhere, so there's good potential, but it's not so much an issue.
That does reduce it, but there's still serious potential of interop issues, or even finding that what you've spec'd out and what you've implemented don't actually match, which happens when you start doing interop.
There are 4 known implementations. 2 of them are widely used.
Well,
they don't have perfect interop, even the 2 that are there. So there's definitely the need for tests.
Yep. So like I said, even stuff that's previously inspect or implemented, there is cost to doing these, especially on the in doing it. I want to make certain we have enough gain from it. And I because these already largely exist under the hood already in 1.0, or equivalents there too exist. It is less frightening than it might be otherwise. And therefore, it's while excluding the tests and interop and complexity side of it, it's not as big a stretch. But there's still a stretch, and I'm not certain we're getting enough new stuff, unless you posit things that are still under discussion, like quick and so forth. However, I'd probably be okay with moving forward on it anyways, because it's not like there's zero gain from it, and I think there's certainly a wish, even if it's not always entirely well supported by facts, always for certain things so I'm a grudging yes.
It does seem like relatively low-hanging fruit, and unblocking other features that are of interest. It would be nice, at least for me, to get some sort of written down, like this is what you'll be able to do, and here's why you can't do it in the old way, just to get an understanding of what we're buying.
Yeah, I would very much like that, because and that's why I've pushed on the use case issue, both on the mailing list and elsewise, is that I want anything we decide to be grounded in the use cases, and those be spelled out, that we're doing this because it'll get us these use cases.
Yeah, from an API perspective, this seems more like an API cleanup than like a whole new engine. It's like, you give your car a nice new body. So from that point, I mean, that seems doable and useful. Yeah. I mean, we get to drop STP, and that's, who doesn't want that?
We'll never drop STP.
You never get to drop anything.
Still alive for a long time. So
it's the web. You don't get to drop things.
Right. It's like a natural increment of the API to me. I mean, do we say? But the scope of NV seems to have shifted just during these meetings. So, I mean,
well, I'm not sure. It probably didn't shift much from what ORTC was. We attempted to shift it, but maybe not. Didn't actually shift it.
But this part, yeah, seems useful.
Yeah.
So for me, it's again in terms of priority. This seems fine, but it's not urgent right now.
Yeah.
So
the priority would be.
I don't want the working group to get too distracted and to sink too much energy in that compared to finishing both the implementations and the WEBRTC 1.0 spec. Minus that, I think that we will probably continue digging into WEBRTC NV. There are some nice new features. There's Quick, for instance, and once we will get there, we'll probably see that, we will do that cleanup as part of that, and that's fine.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think like the use cases will help drive the prioritization, writing those down and hooking them up to this use case needs this piece and this piece and this piece will help you, decide on the prioritization of this, both in the spec side and the implementation side, and that's a good thing, and that'll help everyone. So I think the piece that will be the most painful will probably be the tests.
Yeah. So I think I can speak for Edge on where they stand with this, which is that they're very focused right now on WebRTC 1.0 and completing that work. And the reason is because they see that as shoring up the ORTC object model and making it clear, because almost every bug in that model is a bug in ORTC. So before you've completed that work, you really don't have a solid ORTC spec to move forward on. And you end up with two things which move at once. So at least right now, they're very, very focused on finishing 1.0, or at least the advanced portions which affect the object model, and being clear on that object model. And also because it looks like some things will be doable in 1.0 that won't be doable in NV, necessarily understanding that delta, because one of the things we've learned from developers is they never want to lose functionality that is significant. So I think on behalf of Edge, they'd probably vote yes, but not at the moment.
So it's interesting to know that, and Edge implements part of ORTC already.
Right, all the objects that are in 1.0, they implement.
They probably have testing for that. And it would be great if testing is one issue that they upstream test in WPT.
Well, I can tell you how the testing is done, which is it's done with a WEBRTC 1.0 shim to reuse the WPT tests. So it's not new tests.
It's not really testing it directly or testing the the combinations that aren't possible in 1.0.
Right.
That's a bit sad, but well.
Yeah.
So I'd say I'm roughly in agreement with the Edge team.
So I have a question about features going forward. Prime example would be, I'm excited about writable streams for data channel. Now both peer connection create data channel and ORTC new data channel returns the data channel object.
Right.
Are we going to continue? Would we add readable streams to both, I guess? And there's a general question in there too.
Well, just my opinion is that, again, because developers hate to lose things, if you can decide that you only want it in NV as a method of trying to get them to move, or you can just decide, hey, because if it's doable in 1.0, we're going to do it just because that's the easiest way to get it out. In which case you can't have it lost in NV. You got you kind of have to.
I think what we talked about before with doing it as an extension spec, and so it would be an NV and an extension spec for 1.0.
Yeah, so extension specs can cover both, or they can cover one or the other, depending on what they're chartered to do.
Well, speaking as someone that's tried to deliver features, trying to force someone into stop not using a feature by tempting him with an unrelated one, rarely works.
Never works.
They talk to your manager and say,
"You're an idiot.
Oh, we want both."
Exactly.
That's right.
Let's not try that.
There's a good example though. If I were to add support for WebRTC in workers, I would have to do some work, and I would probably prefer to do that work on new objects.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, probably.
Well, that's interesting.
On just once on peer connection, for instance, I don't know. There are some objects that we will expose that will be simpler. So there might be some. I need to dig into it more, but it might be something that I would check. And
well, that actually could be a very significant reason to move to a new object model if you could do workers more effectively.
Well, in fact, we've talked about in almost tried specking. Allowing data channels to be transferable to workers.
Right.
So,
but that could be done either in 1.0.
I'm not talking about
that could be done easily in either.
I'm not talking about transferring. I'm mostly talking about constructing peer connection or constructing
directly
different objects directly. And in that case, I would like to check first, and that may be something.
Well, you're not going to break any existing code anyway by not porting all of peer connection to workers. So it's an opportunity to start fresh, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, given that there's no support in workers today, it doesn't mean you don't have to pull the whole old API into workers. You could just do the new API. There are some downsides to that, in that everyone would have to use a new API, and people have been using the old API already, as Bernard was speaking to. Maybe happy just keeping with what they already know and already have code for, and just having that code instantiated in a worker.
Sure.
They already have their
in
code.
that case, they will shim peer connection, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's possible too.
Which is fine too.
So for workers, I'm happy to consider that the possibility of not doing the peer connection itself. I would love to see everything in the workers.
But does that mean only the new API? Because the new API is sort of the old API, except for peer connection. But I mean, if you have all the pieces that the peer connection is built on top of in the worklet, then it's the
I would
same
say
thing.
there would be no peer connection object in the worker. And one way to look at it would be to say that an interface in the worker is a new interface, so to speak. That just happens to either look like an old one.
I'm not an expert on the web workers, but to me, supporting construction of an ICE transport and an SCTB transport, and that's it, inside of a worker sounds a lot easier than supporting the construction of all the peer connection stuff.
Okay, so you pick and choose some of this stuff.
Because like it's this much code and interface and everything is this much. Right. There's like way more dependencies that go into a peer connection.
And I'll say there is I can't think of a lot. Maybe there's a few things in peer connection and all the subsequent APIs that are in any way inherently problematic for a worker. The biggest issue is actually probably on things like get user media and things like that, and how you handle transferring streams between the main thread and the workers.
Yeah, I agree. It's mostly a matter of implementation. You might have some objects that say, "Oh, I'm in the background thread. I will go to the main thread." But if you're in a worker, that does not work. You need to post a task to a specific thread. So you need to handle that work, that code. And if there's less code to port, maybe it's easier to handle.
Yeah, the biggest issue would be if you want to have multiple workers interacting. I'd have to think about that one.
So what is the next step on that particular item? Is it trying to understand the worker story better?
For my mind, the worker story is actually a bigger potential enabler of use cases than a lot of the other stuff. Because that getting this stuff off the main thread into workers improves a bunch of stuff. There are some security concerns too related to workers and so forth, but I think we sort of know what those are.
So who would be driving this exploration?
You had some more slides. I had some slides
about the other kind of worker where you can inject JavaScript into the pipeline, not the other.
Worklets.
It's not server worklets.
Worklets.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll very, very quickly, because I don't want to derail us any further, say that I've talked to the main WASM architect at Mozilla, Luke Wagner, and he is happy to help with defining WASM worklets that could be used for doing whatever off the main thread. There is an issue with potential garbage collection and needing a JS context. If you allow these things to be allocating JS buffers and so forth, you could use fixed buffers, and you could define even a WASM worklet, and he suggested this, which does not even have a JS context and cannot allocate JS garbage collected memory. It would just use fixed buffers or buffers that are passed to it. But that would effectively be the equivalent of portable compiled code that could be used on, and you could call that from our existing encoder threads and so forth directly without having to do any fancy setup or allocating JS context for it or anything like that. So that's something we could look at exploring. So enough said about that.
That'd be nice. I have some slides where I have outlined some places where we could inject something like that.
Yeah, so perhaps we should talk about that, or I should get you in touch with Luke.
Okay.
Still, do we have a volunteer to push the worker exploration forward?
Yeah. I would love to, but I have other responsibilities at this point. So I can't commit to the sort of work, spec work that we required for that level of effort. I'd be happy to support in kibitz and maybe help out with it.
Yeah, I'll need to check internally how or whether we can manage these kind of things and get back to a working group.
Sounds like this is
Yeah, I already have some stuff on my backlog as well, but I'm interested.
So it sounds like this is an interesting thing that may enable some important use cases, and we're looking for an owner.
Right.
Who has the time. Because I think and also, what might be useful for people in the group is to think about what use cases this would enable. Because if we can define some tempting use cases this enables, then you may be able to persuade people to pay attention and spend the time.
It's true that we have some use cases that were brought up in the mailing list. Maybe it can be extended, but there are already things available. Maybe we should summarize them again. I don't really know somewhere, but
I think it'd be good to at least know what those are.
So I know that some of my use cases are impossible to do without workers.
Right.
In particular, in the in-stream cases, they just have to have workers. So
Is that workers or worklets?
Workstar. I don't know what the best design is yet, but I do think I'll be charged with figuring that one out.
Yeah, can you start a thread on what this enables with your initial cut on some ideas? And people can add to it.
Can do that.
Just clarify again, it seems like there are two things that sound similar. One is the worklets for in-pipe media manipulation, and the separate one is creating peer connection type, not peer connection, but creating new connections from service workers.
Right.
That's one to service
workers, including possibly service workers.
Right.
Yes.
And I think they are likely to be very different, and they enable very different use cases.
Yeah.
So I think we probably want to keep the two conversations separate.
Yes.
And I agree. While the names sound similar, they're actually very different things.
Anyway, I think we've heard some people interested in helping out possibly more, depending on whether they can cover time. So I guess that's something we'll be following up.
Okay. So what do we have next on the agenda, Stefan?
There's some stuff on the agenda with I think there was RTP transport and worklet. So I had some
is it
worklet,
in
and I
the
think
slide
you were-
deck
you were
here
up
somewhere?
front. I added some slide for you for RTP transport.
Oh,
that
down
were
at the bottom?
from mine, and I added some slides for me for worklets.
Okay, it's here, starts here?
Yeah.
Okay. How about it? And we'll go to 4, I guess.
Okay, so this is kind of a, I don't know, idea I had yesterday. Maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not, so let me know. Basically, I went through, when you presented on worklets, I thought, wow, that's cool that high performance things can be done that way. So I went through and looked through the Chromium code, and I found that there are quite a few things. These are some of the more high performance ones. There's a long list of things that either use worklets or JavaScript callbacks in a similar way. And these are the ones that are a place where you would expect things to be very fast, right? It's during some kind of animation or layout or painting or audio. So I thought, well, where could we stick things in the media pipeline? Is this an area that would help with the media pipeline? And we still have some use cases we haven't figured out how to do. At least we have performance concerns over ways that it would be done on the main thread. So can we do it off the main thread using worklets? There are two versions of my crazy idea. One of them that involves streams and one that does not. So here's the version that does not involve streams. So the idea is that you have worklets you can add to an RTP sender or an RTP receiver. For example, here, you could say, all right, I want to be the packetizer. So my little worklet of JavaScript is going to run off the main thread. It's going to consume an encoded frame, and it's going to produce some RTP packets. So if I wanted to do my own end-to-end encryption there, I could. And I put a little comment on the side, which is maybe when it's executing in that worklet, we could make sure web crypto promises resolve immediately, so it effectively acts synchronously. So you could use web crypto without all the async difficulties. Similarly, on the RTP receiver side, you could say, okay, when the packets come in, I will handle them as a worklet, and then I will produce encoded frames. And so that would allow the application to be in the middle of the media pipeline and customize things if it needs to, but not be on the main thread and still be performant. You could also do it with encoders if you wanted to do your own encoders, decoders, or jitter buffers here. But I know that's a less important use case, so that's why I emphasized the one that could help with the end-to-end encryption. And then if we added one more method, this would actually give you a rather hacky way of getting custom transports. So you could, for example, say, okay, set the packetizer to consume the encoded frame, but actually go and stick that in the quick transport. And then when I get something from the quick transport, I'll inject it into the RTP receiver. So that's the inject worklets directly by calling a stick the worklet here on the RTP sender. So this is the key part here and here. I also included, I figured that you might want the original method in case the custom method wants to call the original. So it doesn't have to re-implement everything. It can just take what was packetized and then do something extra on top. And then there's the version with a readable stream. This is like combining all the new stuff together. Worklets and streams and the media pipeline all in one. Okay, so go with me for a little bit. First, we define a thing I'll call an RTC worklet, which is basically you take a worklet and a readable stream, and then they run off the main thread, and they produce a new readable stream. Okay, so that's your core thing you're working with. And now you go on some of our objects that are in the pipeline and you add readable streams. So you can say, okay, a media stream track has frames, an RTP sender has encoded frames and RTP packets, an RTP receiver has RTP packets, and an RTP receiver has encoded frames. And then you have some methods where you can set an altered readable stream, one that's been transformed, to have a new source of encoded frames or packets. So here's some examples of what can happen if you do this. If you wanted to do a custom encoder or decoder, you could say, all right, RTP sender, I'm going to take frames from the media stream track. I'm going to transform them in an RTC worklet off the main thread where my encoder exists. And then I'm going to use that as the source for the encoded frames, which will go right into the rest of the pipeline as is. On the decode side, you could say, okay, I got an RTP receiver. It's spitting out encoded frames as is, but I'm going to take that and transform it off on a separate thread or whatever a worklet does, and then provide that as a source of decoded frames into a media stream track. If we wanted to do a form of perk or double, you could say, all right, I'll take the packets that are already coming out of an RTP sender, but before they go off onto the network, I'm going to transform that stream in a RTC worklet, and then I'm going to provide that as the source for the packets. So basically, you're transforming the packets in flight off on a worklet off the main thread. On the receive side, do the same, but in reverse. The RTP receivers, RTP packets, and then I'm setting the source for the RTP packets on the RTP receiver. If you wanted to have a custom transport for media, such as Quick, you could say, all right, this is the hacky part. I will make an RTP sender, but I will pull the encoded frames out. I will transform them into a series of messages or streams or whatever you want to call it, serialized buffers. And I will provide that as a source of streams for the quick transport, which will then send them off as separate streams. And that can all happen off the main thread, assuming you have this RTC worklet and a quick transport.setStream source, which would be a relatively easy method to implement.
On the flip side, you could say, okay, get from the quick transport a stream source, which is every time a stream comes in, we'll read out the bytes and hand it to this and make a stream of it. And we'll hand that to an RTC worklet. And off the main thread, it will transform those things into encoded frames, which is really just a deserialization, such as CBOR deserialize. And then we'll set that as an encoded frame source on an RTP, sorry, that should be receiver, which will then, of course, dump that into a track. Finally, you could even have an RTP data channel just by setting directly a readable stream of RTP packets onto an RTP sender. And then you could have the reverse for RTP receivers. I ran out of space on the slide, but it'd be the same. So if you had this primitive of an RTC worklet, which allows you to modify a readable stream off the main thread, and then you added these readable streams on these objects and these places where you can inject the readable streams into these objects, we could have all of these use cases, but without any new objects other than the quick transport, obviously. We wouldn't have to break out the encoder from the RTP sender or receiver or the RTP transport. So that's my crazy idea.
That's like all the use cases covered. Do you think there would be overhead to having worklets? Like,
So,
let's say you implement the same thing that we have today with worklets. What would be the extra cost?
The extra cost of worklets?
Like of wiring it this way. Yeah, that worklets.
This
would you have to
worklet-
like copy stuff back and forth?
No, so the worklets could operate on buffers without copying. In the case of like, well, actually, that's a good question. So
that is the $64,000 question.
So in the in this case, the worklet could operate in place and not necessarily have to copy. This one is kind of interesting. So when you're transforming, say, the RTP packet into the RTP packet, maybe we could define a worklet that
so the
modifies
attributes are defined on the main objects on the main thread, and then you have worklets which I believe operate with their own set of memory. Like, could you say
that,
this?
Right? So I can speak a little to that, having talked to Luke, and I'm not an expert on WASM, but I did discuss this specifically with regards to WebRTC with him. This gets back to the thing I was talking about with the JS contexts and garbage collection and so forth. If you're allocating and letting go of JS memory from these worklets, you will eventually get garbage collection occurring, which will cause long delays at random points in your worklet. If you can avoid that by using fixed buffers for input and output that are passed in or pre-allocated as part of the worklet or whatever, then you can potentially avoid you certainly can avoid the garbage collection problem, and you can potentially avoid also needing a JS context entirely. And that,
so in the two parts to that, at least in the implementation in Chrome, when these worklets are executed, they can be executed in their own what's called an isolate, which means it's in its own little JavaScript world. It has no connection to the outside world, and you can specify, okay, it only gets these buffers, and that's how web audio works.
Right. That's the sort of the way, like I said, that's the sort of the way web audio works to avoid allocating. The point is, if you allocate memory in a JS way there, and let it go, then eventually you have to garbage collect. So you you set up the API to avoid that. Okay?
Yeah, I think for many of these, like encoding or serializing frames, there's no reason why you would need to allocate. I mean,
you have to make big buffers, maybe much bigger than you actually would need, and so forth.
Another worklet read, or would you have to write it once, then you copy it over to the other worklet's memory, and then you read? Like,
I keep being told by people who are experts in readable streams that like magic can happen. Like you plug them together and.
It really depends. But
are for buffers, right? I know I said everything should be readable streams in NV, but if we always have a whole frame, that might be the one case where a single buffer might be better, unless JavaScript is going to be, because in this case the browser will be the one feeding the JavaScript to frame, so it can control that part and maybe make that simpler.
So the biggest concern I have with the worklet stuff, and you were asking about what's the overhead of implementing the current stuff in worklets. So I'll go back to that question. The biggest issue is that there are certain things that the worklets are not going to be able to do. They are not going to be able to access at this point hardware encode decode sort of resources for codecs. At this point, though this will probably eventually change, WASM has no support for SIMD type operations. So video codecs, while possible, would probably not be a great idea. For audio, much more possible. It might be less efficient, but not problematically so. And obviously for other things that are less signal processing overhead oriented, it would probably not be a problem at all in terms of performance. I mean, it might be slower than a native C++ implementation or Rust implementation, but the difference would probably not be important or significant for the other things.
So I think one thing which is important is that we started to set some requirements, and of the main thread, for instance, is nice. No garbage collection is nice. So we have some list, and then we might be able to define the model. So starting with these requirements is great. Second thing is, yes, there's a model that might work. Will it work? We don't know, and we should monitor or even push the people that are doing web audio processing using WASM to continue their investigation. And if it's proving that it's working in terms of efficiency, in terms of debuggability, in terms of repeatability of deployment in different devices, if it's working for web audio, we might also check for video frames as well for processing. If we validate that, then we have something that is that will be very easily handle that. If it's not the case, then I wouldn't want to go there probably.
So if somebody wanted to go and sort of experiment and see if these things can in fact be performant, which version of this does the working group?
So I would go with web audio and monitoring what they're doing, and I would go also with experimenting with get user media processing video frames.
So I think the thing that you definitely need is the ability to fire events from your worklet. So some kind of data back to the main thread that, hey, I've done 100,000 packets, or I found a banana, or whatever. That you need to be able to support that in a way that works. And I'm not convinced that streams allow you to do that.
Yeah, one of the interesting issues here that I discussed with Luke is the control surfaces for these. You know, right now in our implementations on encoder threads and so forth, we have these control surfaces and so on. If we're putting worklets in there, we need to make those control surfaces part of the specification, okay? And we need therefore to anticipate what future needs for control might be needed, or escape valves for future controls might be needed, so the application can feed in the controls. And more importantly, so that things like our encoder stream could tell could tell the codec implemented in WASM that it should skip frames, or that it should down-res when it does this, or it should SVC it, and so forth. And that's where that's probably actually where, assuming we can do all the rest of it, that's where the real complexity comes, is those control surfaces.
Couldn't you just post message or whatever the standard way of doing it is?
So the spec to look at here, I think, just sorry to interrupt, is the audio worklet spec, because that's the one that's closest to us. It's media. And they've already solved all this. I've added a link to slide 95. You can go look there. And the key to it is to stay off main thread entirely, right? And then you have these post messages that are also in the audio worklet spec that you send control messages back and forth. So here where you have media stream track.frames, it's not clear to me that if the frames are on the main thread, that's a problem, because like in Firefox,
everything I'm pointing out here are like
sure,
not off the main thread. Everything.
So you want to set up an environment, you know, packets come in from the network on the background thread already. You don't want to go to the main thread at all. You want to go straight into this audio worklet JavaScript code, let it do its thing. and then not touch the main thread at all. Maybe send some control messages.
Yeah, I fully agree with Randall on the fact that there we are seeing, hey, let's do a pipeline defining JavaScript once, and it will run and run and run and run. Except that at some point there may be a problem of like packet loss, in which case you might create more keyframes. So you need to react to that and handle that properly. It might create some CPU burst because of that. That might have other effects, because if you need to change your options from the JavaScript, which is in main thread, by doing post message things, for instance, it might delay and derail a little bit the feedback loop that you're actually trying to implement.
Right, and that's why I was saying you need to define those control interface, because those controls, in most cases, I believe, will not be coming from main thread. Those controls will be coming from the internals of the implementation. So if you're going to have, let's say, an encoder WASM worklet, okay, that you can use in this place, you need to define more than just it takes a bunch of bytes in and throws a bunch of bytes out. You need to the 90% of the work in doing this will be defining that control interface for that encoder.
You can pass arguments into the worklet.
Arguments is one thing though, but you have to anticipate future arguments and so forth. Right now, this is all hidden deep inside the code. Where
isn't that an implementation detail of whoever is writing the worklet, how to control it? Like,
no, because it's interfacing with code that's not in the worklet.
You can pass in an option
you need
subject,
a way
right?
for any, like, you need to be able to say something to the RTP sender and then it passes it down.
Right,
off that,
and
it
there'll
does
be
the thread hop basically.
And there'll be stuff that's occurring, between the RPT sender and where it goes to the encoder, that is, other pieces of code in that stream that will make decisions about stuff like dropping threads or whatever.
On a per frame basis, or just like, is it okay to have a slight delay?
Yes. To anything you say there, yes, it could happen.
I think we could like just take a step back a little bit there.
Yeah.
It seems that there are some steps that we could identify to make progress there. The requirements, the validation of the models with different approaches, and then we could refine our model, find some problems, identify them, fix them, and so on. So if we can organize that already, that's pretty nice. And if we can document these requirements and these initial steps, that would be great.
I think there's considerable opportunity here. Okay, I think using worklets in this WASM worklets in this fashion is potentially interesting and enables some interesting cases. I think we need to investigate this with the WASM people and find out what we can do and what we can't, and what the overheads are and what the constraints on interfaces like can we use streams or not and so forth are. I think we need to investigate how we're going to deal with the whole control surface part of this, which will impact that too.
And I agree with you, and we should also look at the audio worklet and see how they mature and what problems they run into.
A crazy idea. You said we don't have access to the hardware encoder, for example. But I mean, this defines where you pipe everything. Couldn't you like pipe it to a sender that does the hardware encoder by default, and then pipe it to some other sender?
So the idea, I guess, would be if you do not define a worklet, an encoder worklet, what do you get? Hey, you get the hardware encoder or the software encoder that VOS is providing, or something like that.
These are completely separate things here. So if you were to say add double encryption, that doesn't change the encoding, right? You'd still get the hardware encoder.
Right, and there's certain cases here which are likely.
I'd like to.
So up leveling, there's maybe potential here. Should we look more into the give it a worklet, regardless of streams, or give it a worklet that thinks in terms of streams?
I think we need to, and I think we need to ask some of the WASM JS people about whether or not streams work.
We don't have enough information to answer that question. Okay. I think we need to charge someone with figuring out.
Higher level then. What should we do next in regards to injecting workloads into our media pipeline?
I think we should I should talk to Luke, and I should have Luke talk to whoever else is interested in this, along with some of the people who were doing audio worklet, like Paul Adno, working on the audio spec, and maybe Carl Tomlinson, who's implementing it for us, and whoever on your side, and whoever else is interested from Apple or whoever. And I think we should at least talk about it.
Sounds like Randall's signing up.
I'm signing up to help with the investigation.
Who else is signing up?
I'll talk about, I'm happy to work with you on the use cases. I don't know about the implementation. I know what I would want to put in them.
Use cases, defining
You mean
what
where
the
you
use
would want
case-
to inject them?
And what they would want to do.
Right, that's what I mean.
Yeah, that also helps with thinking about what the control surfaces would be. And some of these may be much more possible than others. The codec ones are the particularly nasty ones from the...
Yeah, I think we got a little too distracted by that one. The others are quite a bit easier, like, you know, RTP packet is a buffer, and then there's another buffer, and you're just changing the buffer.
Yeah, some of these may be relatively simple.
Randall and everyone, actually, we need to break for coffee, so the chairs get 5 minutes to collect their thoughts.
We'll get at least 2 people signed up to investigate.
But I would like to charge someone with working on this.
I'm happy to work on it. I'd love to have some help with it.
Johan? Oh, great.
Someone write that down.
And then I would also suggest getting the stream experts, so the WG stream guys, into the boat so they can.
Yeah, sure. But we got a few people now. It's coffee.
Yeah, we're up leveling the coffee
time.
It's like 4 p.m. here, and people are starting to get to the leaving time. That's why we're kind of hurrying up.
5 minutes then? Okay.
Unexpected. I had exactly the same thought. Service work. I mean, not to the same, not with the stream. Say.
So it's like it's a basis for the rest of the
Yeah, particularly the things in the sound caps.
And with the consensus to move everything else, we just repeat that. We have consensus to move simulcast.
Yeah.
Once it's moved out, we can try that again. And this discussion is very clearly indicating that if we do growth, it should be defining words.
Right, and also a lot. One of the major that might be a selling bigger than as big as
One of the major things that's one of the major things that's well that we want to share. The biggest work of markets.
Yeah.
What pieces we are, what pieces of we are,
I think one of the priorities was the data.
Service workers? Sometimes I think we have some the past data channels work.
Southeast Asia is very.
That's service worker and shared worker.
We haven't defined which ones.
No.
That basically means the data channels need to be.
That's why I don't want to go back to Europe. But I
If they're constructed, that means that the transport has to be transferred.
Right.
Thank you. I will take that for.
We'll clone them.
We should write those down. People don't escape. Nice. I'm accountable. What items does stick? Hey, I got the targets. I didn't talk to myself.
Still French. It's not the same center.
Yeah,
it's yeah. There is that Canadian movie called One Cop, Bad Cop.
Yeah.
It's a story about a cop from Montreal and a cop from Toronto having to work together.
So,
just listening to the accent.
Outside the context
It's like a bit drinking bar with the jerks in the house. But I spoke to people that was French users. And a joke. No. It's a movie from Quebec. There's one and two. It's really good. It's really, really good. It's on Netflix. I don't know.
It's actually a French pizza.
We got a tea back in Lyon this year. We're gonna rule that thing. It's the Singapore, we have all parts of the English accent. Australia, pretty guys from UK. Yeah, because you can never get it. You have to ask them to repeat that. Yeah, that was specifically difficult accent. You are going to try that. To investigate. Yeah, it's young. That's
no, the workshop. I said we had
study there.
Complete that.
So like the metrics.
The first 20 packets is pretty. You have the river on one
Yeah, so
side.
you want to make
At least we have what we see, and we just have to make sure.
There is a bus to go down.
Right. Well, that's part of it. Is the 1 hour.
That's why they got the.
It's largely self.
This area where there is
Yeah, it's kind of, I would say.
It's MD because
Right. So it's like, but follow this on.
Even
Frankly,
remember in Japan,
next time we recycle WEBRTC
requirement.
you see that we should have all of that done. I hope. Because we never.
next time.
It's better in Thailand.
And I guess that's probably
The question is from what? Is we speaking about lives or Stefan, what is he doing next? No, but he stayed with Ericsson. So he just came back from paternal leave and he just came back from paternal leave, right?
Yeah, but what's the thing we actually decide on?
Okay, so not like
We actually had a long
not
list.
like
Did we ever decide? So we surprised us.
Say, why don't we? Someone mentioned it, why don't we suggest this PR thing? Why don't we just simulate, ask us to always
Look at his face right now. Look at his like, really, really, you just say that.
We might want to remove things. We might want to remove simulcast. So maybe
You
you
can
can pray.
maybe you can find a We decided to reach out to the WEBRTC because he was massacred by the WEBRTC rep. So we need to.
Next meeting,
I think it was
Donald
fully
coming back in
justified.
Rambo
No, it's
mode,
not.
you know. They still didn't find gold. They proposed to change the construction.
Yeah.
Last call for.
Stefan is doing here. He's got multiple slides.
NPM is a good
He's got
example.
multiple slides. Things
And,
we agreed to do
like
in
you don't have,
names.
you don't have enough.
He's got names.
Yeah.
It's like,
I think you've made an escape.
Yes, we need to add something more.
Well, actually,
He's not, you're not on the list.
That's
How can that be?
Guys, I'm going to tell you what you need.
Yeah, before any of this. Like it was the first thing that you started.
Ah,
Like no one was.
My brother used to do that. Still doing it. So people are filing bugs against it as furiously.
If we add that reflex size stuff.
Yeah. Seth is, I like Seth because he's like, he submits PRs for the bugs.
Yeah.
So he's like, nice, not so much. I guess they're mostly questions about us. Pretty sophisticated. Seth is that young? I said, okay, go.
So like it's not my account.
Yeah, I mean, the detailed questions they were asking, I understand my question. But what I'm saying, fine with this particular state. Slightly. Where do you find these people? But he's been around on the street. I'm actually so I totally I figure that if I learn in 6 months, I'm not sure my head is like for example.
I hope the slides are reasonably up to date. Yeah, 2 slides.
Yep. So you take it. Okay, 5 minutes are up.
Yep.
And then some. We start. So this is the wrap up and next steps. Once we're done with this, anyone whose brain is completely empty can stop trying to think.
It never started. Okay. So this is the chair's attempt to write up what we agreed and how we move forward from here. And it's open for some discussion. So if you realize something is missing, tell us so, and we might add it. We think it's good. So there are 2 slides now. One on 1.0 and family, and another slide on NV. So for 1.0 and family, we agreed to create extension specs and shift out from the main specs identity, and that one will have editors between Ecker, Martin Thompson, and Cullen. We don't know exactly who of those that will be editing. We also said we would shift out simulcast and potentially add SVC to that new extension spec. Harald will do the cutout, and then Sergio and Bernard will start adding SVC stuff there. We also
Sorry, just a question on this. So for identity, we said we would try to get it blessed as CR because it's just taking it out.
Yeah.
For simulcast, if we also add SVC, presumably that's not the same plan.
Well, my proposal would be for SVC optional.
So, I mean,
my proposal would be for SVC to be optional. Simulcast is mandatory to implement. But yeah, so the question is, you're asking whether that would go to CR immediately, and I think if you add stuff, the answer would be no, right?
I would be very surprised if we would get any other answer, but I just want to confirm that we understand this is one of the consequences.
Is that okay, Harold?
I don't see a big problem with it.
Okay. But we probably just have to be conscious of not adding excessive complexity.
So, and then for streams and extra knobs on data channel, we agreed that Lennart, Randall, and Jan-Ivar, the Mozilla gang, would start investigating that and make a proposal. I assume that would be another extension spec. Yeah, it's under that heading. For stats, I think the only thing we concretely agreed was to look into ICE stats. Is that correct, Varun?
For the extension spec.
Yeah, okay.
Oh, and I think there was some comment of adding stats to data channel in 1.0, but someone needs to file a bug.
So it should be something like that. And for the last item, Jan-Ivar, I heard you volunteering to edit screen share, and so did callstats.io, so we might take you up on that offer. I need to find a way to make the text small. Yeah, and I added stuff as well now. Okay.
I think we can also already say
Yeah, someone need to edit that, I mean. Yeah, and then for the NV part, we think we have consensus to continue object cleanout a la WEBRTC for NV. We also think we should continue the work on flex ice. We heard a lot of support for that. And Peter, I assume you will take responsibility for that. There was a big interest in workers and worklets. And Johan, Randall, and Harald agreed to investigate. End-to-end security, Johan, you would do a write-up of that part. I mean, you presented something this morning.
Sure. I'm not sure, like raw media and big interest in Workstar, is it the same thing or is it different?
That comes from the use case discussion yesterday where Göran and Harald, and we had the funded hats example and so on. The conclusion of that discussion was that Harald and Göran would continue investigating what we should do there.
Göran is particularly interested in machine learning. How that relates.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah, but
I think we just recently talked about worklets. Before that,
I think worklets relates a lot to raw media.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Which is item 3 is both, so it's unclear. But
Who would be
I'm having trouble hearing what people are saying away from the mic.
Sorry, I was asking who is going to work on the workers' bits, not the worklets.
Yeah.
So I need to confirm that, but what I said was that I would come back to the working group and maybe participate in that activity, but I just need to figure out how much time I can allocate, in fact.
Should I change the slide in any way?
Well, yes, I think we need to distinguish who is going to work on worklets and who is going to work on worker. If Joran and Harald were to work on raw media, I think that kind of implies they would be working on the worklet model. I hear Johan saying that he would be working on workers. And I guess
Maybe both, but I can't
figure that out.
And I said I would be willing to help by hooking people up with Luca and about some of the worklet stuff and helping push that conversation forward as to what's possible.
So is there anyone else beyond possibly UN working on workers?
Workers or worklets?
Workers.
Was the idea with the workers way to bring the new objects into a different scope so that it would not interact with the pure connection? Or like, I don't understand the distinction at the moment.
I think the confusion is that there are actually three things. There's, to start at the bottom, there's raw media using worklets. And then there's other network data things using worklets, like encoding and decoding. And the third one is the peer connection, like objects being owned in service workers and shared workers exposed. Yeah.
And I would be interested potentially in workers and raw media in work with worklet or something like that.
So nobody else on workers? And I guess that's probably one of the oldest open issue on WebRTC.
I think we would be interested, but we would like to know before we say yes to anything, like if there's energy and what that energy is going to be. Do not want to spend, we have very limited cycles, so if that is something that is of interest overall, we're willing to commit to it.
Harold said he had some use cases that would only really be possible with workers. So I would love to see, start with conversation of what use cases does this enable? Because I can think of there being a number, or what use cases does this significantly improve?
Randall, did you listen to Harald's presentation of yesterday? Because he
I did not.
Ah, okay. But you could look into the slides, but we talked a bit about it yesterday.
I unfortunately do not have the time to lead the worker stuff.
So I think Tim had the best part on use cases for workers, or the best presentation at least. Well, a lot of the speed at any speed thing goes into worklets.
So can I add a team here?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. I'm certainly going to follow both as far as I can, and I'm able to do them, because I think there will be overlaps.
Yeah, and I'll certainly follow the worker stuff. I just can't commit to major time.
For end-to-end security, it's not really investigate, it's more like summarizing the discussions.
Yeah,
and
we said do a write-up.
Yeah.
And finally, we expect you, Peter, to continue pushing for quick in a lot of cases.
Yeah, and I think we've not been involved in this discussion, and we would be more than happy to commit some resources there.
Okay.
Security, Sergio might have some time. Or
I can raise your hand.
okay. I will not be spending time on CV step better.
Okay. That's all we had. Any final words, or should we thank everyone for contributing, and especially thank Google for being an excellent host?
Yes, absolutely.
And go home and be happy.
Thank you all for being excellent guests.
Okay,
And we'll meet again.
we'll meet again.
Yes.
Next physical meeting of this group is TPAC. Leon, remember to sign up.
Leon?
France. I expect Dr. Alex to be providing the local culinary guide.
And thanks everyone online. I feel this meeting is wrapping up now. So
Yeah.
Thank you all and bye.
Thank you guys. Sorry to loom over you so often today.
No problem.
Bye.
Okay. Sleep well, everyone.
Do we do stop recording? Exit meeting?
I will sleep well.
Oh, we stopped the recording.